And we're going to start our workshop with a premise, which is landscapes take up a lot of space in Southern California. If you look at most of Southern California, especially our suburban areas from an aerial photo, like Google Earth or Google Maps, what you will notice is that there is actually quite a bit of green. It's not like it's all downtown LA. It's not like it is all New York City. There might, especially at the street level, be a need for more green and more areas that are unpaved, but there's a lot of land to work with, actually. And for a long time, the main question, especially for front yards, has been, does it fit in? Does it fit in with the neighborhood? And if someone wanted to be a little bit eccentric and get beyond that, the main question, even until the last few years that I would hear people talking about, is what does it look like? And what it looks like is very important. I really want to see beautiful native or beautiful landscapes of any sort in front yards. Especially, we want our communities to be beautiful. But the last series of droughts really opened up, I think, an opportunity for a new question. And it's been really exciting in the past couple of years, especially to hear that starting to shift. And there's, I think, many cultural factors that are relating to the beginning of that shift. But here's what I see as the new question for our landscapes. What do they do? What do they do for us? What do they require for inputs, whether it's resources or our labor, our time or attention? And what do we want to get out of them? And that is fundamentally something that has not been the case for quite a while. And I think has never really been the case as a strong motivating factor for what we decide to do on our landscapes since the kind of explosion of single family housing and kind of the suburbs over most of California. What do we really want our landscapes to do? And one of the big ideas is that California native landscapes just do more. I really feel that native landscapes do the most for us while requiring not a whole lot. Nothing is a no maintenance landscape. That does not exist. That's a myth. But for what California native landscapes demand of us, they do so much. And we're going to explore that quite a bit. So what is a California native plant for those of you who are brand new to this? People can argue over the best way to frame a scientific definition, but really to keep it simple, a California native plant is generally considered to be a plant that has been here for a very long time. A plant that evolved in California along with the insects, birds, and other animals that did as well. Now, just because a plant is native to California doesn't necessarily mean it's a great idea to grow it in your yard. So for example, like redwoods are native to California. They're pretty fussy and difficult and require a lot of water to grow in inland Southern California. Desert plants, even though we aren't the true desert where I am, grow great in our yards at home and do particularly well and flower in a lot of the summer. So they're great to mix into our gardens, but someone in foggy coastal Northern California won't have as much success. And so California native is the big category, but we also want to be thinking about what's likely to do well in our yards at home. And that really is often based on just logic of where the conditions are similar, but also our local resources and as well our local nurseries where we would buy these plants tend to focus on that as well. So that doesn't need to be something that's really confusing or mystifying. Just wanted to definitely mention that as we're talking about the definition of a native plant. And so what makes these native plants special? Why do we want to think about planting these native plants maybe instead of rosemary or lavender? And I will say that it's not an all or nothing thing. I have a couple of lavender plants that I grow at home. Our yard is mostly either edible plants or California native plants, but my partner makes great lemonade that's flavored with lavender in the summer. And so we like to have a couple of lavender plants to be able to cut and do that. So it doesn't need to be all or nothing. But what makes California native plants special is that if we select the native plants that make sense for where we are living, they tend to be very well adapted to our conditions, to our seasons, to the heat. If you select them for the soil, to the soil, they tend to not need any compost. They don't need any fertilizer. They don't need a lot of water. There are very few pest and disease problems. They evolved here and they are set to thrive here, which makes them much more of a pleasure to grow from a horticultural standpoint. So much easier to grow even our fussy native plants than it is to be successful long-term with like azaleas or gardenias or something like that. And in addition to that, they have evolved relationships with other native plants and animals. So our native pollinators, some of our native birds, our native butterflies, many of them are specialists that really require specific native plants or specific groups of native plants for them to thrive. And with so much of their initial habitat range having been plowed over for agriculture or for housing and really no longer being available, what we do in our yards makes a real and true difference to supporting those species in a way that rosemary, lavender, and lantana just does not. So that is one of the reasons why native plants are so important. Even for species that aren't necessarily like listed species of concerns or in danger, the population numbers for many of these species is much, much lower than it was a few decades ago. And by putting these plants, which are also beautiful, into our yards, it is something that we can do to help. Will it change the world? In a small way, yes. It won't solve all of the problems, but it is a part of the solution. And if we are going to be putting plants into our yard and caring for them anyways, why not take beautiful plants that are relatively easy to grow, require little maintenance, and do all of that? So for a lot of you, you're already growing some native plants. I won't spend too much more time on that. We go into it deeper in the wildlife habitat class, which we have on our YouTube channel, which is called Gardening for Birds, Butterflies, Pollinators, and more. But that's the basic idea. So why would we want native plants in our gardens? Well, let me tell you a little bit about my morning this morning. Every time I teach this topic, I just take my camera out into my yard early in the morning and take some pictures. Because in a native garden, if you design it to be that way, every single day of the year, something extraordinary is going on. So this is just a very quick walk. I didn't even make it into my front yard because I had to get ready to come into work. But this is a very brief walk in my backyard this morning. And so it's already been getting kind of hot. It's early June. I would kind of consider this past peak season for color and things like that. But there's so much to look at. And you can design, if you want, and we'll talk about this, to have color, which also relates to nectar for pollinators, food for birds after different things dry out all throughout the year. So woolly blue curls, a local California native plant, has a reputation for being tricky to grow, but it's mostly because it wants to be left alone with no water as soon as it is established at all. Woolly blue curls blooms almost year round in my yard, looking very beautiful. And then I heard something going on a little bit off to my right and saw a goldfinch picking through some dried seed on a branch that had been pruned. But after we do some pruning, we tend to leave the developed seed around in the yard because those are bird feeders. We don't put out bird feeders, we grow our own bird food. And then immediately in front of me, saw a female carpenter bee. Most of our native bees, or all of our native bees, are very non-aggressive. Physiologically, they can sting if they're just, if like someone's trying to crush them between their hands, but they don't sting people. But going around getting nectar from this Allen Chickering sage. And then heard a little bit of a splash. And over in our bird bath, we have a sparrow in a patch of area that we keep clear and grow annual wildflowers, and then let those flowers dry out for bird seed. And so the sparrow was taking a drink and a bath. And this is my favorite way to do bird baths, by the way, just a saucer that's easy to dump out and easy to scrub down and clean on a tree stump. Bird baths don't need to be expensive. A patchy plume looks pretty much gorgeous year round. Even when it's not in flower, these seed plumes just catch the light in a beautiful way, especially in the morning and the evening. And this time of year, once it starts getting hot, the native buckwheats, this is their element. So this is a little bit more obscure one that you would get from a specialty nursery like the California Botanic Garden or Theodore Payne Foundation down here in Southern California. This is a naturally occurring hybrid, Blissiana Buckwheat, with huge, each of these flower clusters is like bigger than my outstretched hand, and the native pollinators and beneficial insects just go crazy for it. Tucked in a little bit more partial shade and where it gets some extra water from fruit tree irrigation, we are growing narrowleaf milkweed, which this time of year is covered in monarchs. If you plant narrowleaf milkweed, which can be kind of a bit of a messy thing, likes a little bit of water and in hot inland, a little bit of afternoon shade. It's a great one for the bottom of the yard or grouped with fruit trees, but you will be supporting monarch butterflies, which need the support right now, especially in inland areas. If you plant it in a couple of years, they will be there and you'll just have monarchs flying around your yard most of the summer, especially as well, but a lot of the year. California bush sunflower, past its prime for flowering, still lots of good color on it. But as these seed heads dry out, bird food. So had to do a little bit of trimming on it already this season, but left some at the top untrimmed for the flowers to continue. But we chop off the developed seeds and we leave them in the mulch layer, and some birds will come and eat the seeds when they're up on the plant, but a whole bunch of other birds are more of ground foragers, including mourning doves and towhees, so other native birds. Monarchs also really enjoying the nectar, the adult monarchs, as well as other butterflies, but the monarch was the one I got a picture of this morning on Yarrow. That beautiful purple color of Winifred Gilman Cleveland sage. Mix in some rocks and some logs, lots of habitat for lizards. So western fence lizard hanging out. And then birds. So lots of birds around, but just got a nice picture of a hummingbird who lives in our yard and is very sassy, always chasing other hummingbirds off, very territorial. Just coming into bloom, this white sage, flowers stretching towards the sky. Have another white sage that's almost done blooming and the birds are eating the seed out of it. And this one is kind of just really getting going. And then golden currant, which is a beautiful flowering shrub in the spring and then develops these little berries, which are edible for humans, tend to be very tart, but the birds love them once they're fully ripe. And around then I realized I have to get going and head into work to teach this class. So I didn't even make it to the front yard, but with a native garden, something interesting happening year round. So that's a big part of why you would want it in your garden, and different birds, different butterflies, different pollinators going on all the time. Our gardens become such more interesting spaces, totally different than the idea of a traditional landscape where you are going to be spending a lot of time and a lot of effort mowing, fertilizing, trying to keep things like a static picture all throughout the year. It takes a lot of work, and oftentimes it's not that successful anyways. A native garden really embraces the change throughout the season, embraces that things are going to be coming and going, and we can plant them with a little bit of research to really fully lean into that and really enjoy that. So that's, for me, a lot of why I am interested in native gardens. And I could do that walk in the winter, and the plants I would take pictures of would largely be different, but all that going on. I happen to have a pretty large backyard. My partner's a horticulturist as well, and the big trashed backyard was why we bought the fixer-upper house that we have. But you can accomplish that in a small yard as well with design. So that's what we're going to talk about. So really quickly, before we leave that, just to summarize, why would we want these native plants in our garden? Well, definitely beauty. Just as beautiful, if not, in my opinion, more beautiful than the kind of more generic, quote, exotic plants that we're used to in nurseries. So that's definitely not part of it to be under or overlooked. So these are just some of my California favorite native plants. Habitat. Your garden can look however you want it to look. It could look more formal or it could look less, but especially if you embrace kind of a naturalistic garden style, which can be very beautiful. It doesn't need to be this naturalistic, but definitely can be. But having some amount of plant density and cover especially really amplifies that habitat, and you will find yourself with things like seen from our backyard where we get hawks every once in a while and falcons coming by to check out what's going on as well as all the other great things that we see on a daily basis. Resource conservation is definitely part of it. Most native gardens in Southern California, after they're established, are only watered deeply about once a month, maybe once every 3 weeks in the summer. A lot of those plants, after they're established, could live through the summer without that, but that really keeps them looking quite nice in our yards, having them not really go kind of fully dormant in the summer. So just some supplement. And if you live in an urban wildland interface zone, it also keeps down the flammability of those native plants. Usually first year, I'll water deeply about once a week, tapering off after that. And you kind of know when things are established, when they really have had that spurt of growth and are really kind of taking on, for the smaller plants, they're full size. For the larger plants, have just really grown significantly. Ease of care. Work smarter, not harder. Most of these plants only need to be touched for a little bit of cleanup once or twice a year. And it happens to be that time generally tends to concentrate in the spring or in the fall, where it's a pleasure to be outside in the garden. Not that much to do other than occasional water and a little bit of weeding in the summer when, we want to be outside with a cold drink in the shade if we're outside generally and not doing heavy garden work like pushing a lawnmower. And all that makes our gardens much more enjoyable places to live and to learn. And so whether that's for you or for your kids or your grandkids, these gardens become places of lifelong learning where there's always something new to see. You start to recognize patterns. So for example, like some birds will live in a garden in Southern California year round. Other ones will come and go depending on the season. So for example, in our yard, white-crowned sparrows come down in the fall, and that's how we know it's really starting to be the cool season. They spend the winter down here, and in spring they head back up into the San Gabriel Mountains, and that's something that we can rely on and look forward to every year. We're kind of their winter home, and there's lots of other things like that that you begin to tune into and begin to notice in a way that you just never get with the conventional landscape. Provides us with a sense of place. I like this quote from Lady Bird Johnson. She was former First Lady and was one of the first vocal proponents nationwide, kind of on that national stage, of working with plants native to the region in our cultivated landscapes. And she said, native plants give us a sense of where we are in this great land of ours. I want Texas to look like Texas and Vermont to look like Vermont. I am much more cynical than Lady Bird Johnson, but my take is it costs a lot to live in California. And if I am lucky enough to have a patch of land where I could decide what's going to be planted there, why on earth would I want to spend a bunch of work making it look like a parched imitation of what in America is an East Coast landscape style, which is derived from a temperate European landscape style that was developed for rich landowners to show off the fact that they didn't need to use their land for more productive purposes. That has nothing to do with my life here in Southern California. I would rather choose to wake up to the natural beauty of California every day and enjoy it every evening. So we can make that decision and have all these other benefits in the process. And it also gives your cat something really interesting to look at. Tons of entertainment for our indoor cats. So here are some of the big ideas that are going to guide our whole framework as we start to look at California native landscapes and California native landscape design. We are embracing the fact that the garden is a living ecosystem. While our California native gardens can be, and should be beautiful, it is so different than the kind of old landscape paradigm where a garden is something kind of like beautiful you take a picture of, and the ideal garden is something that you could like see in a fancy glossy magazine. A garden is so much more dynamic and so much more exciting. You can never capture a truly beautiful native garden in a photograph because it's working in so many different dimensions. Visual, yes, but smell, all of the life that's in it, all sorts of different things. And with that come changes throughout the year, but also sometimes disturbance, and that's fine. And so see a picture of a nest and a young goldfinch that grew up in our garden a couple of years ago. The garden is in process. It's never finished. It's always in motion, and that's okay. Embrace that. So this was one of the last parts of my yard to get planted, a couple of years after we started on the garden. You don't need to do it all at once. And here near my bird bath. One of the first plants that we planted there turned out, just from needing to refill the bird bath, it was too much water and it died. That's fine. Learn from it, try something else, move on. Even the most beautiful glossy magazine kind of gardens in the world always have something that doesn't look good and dying. The professional photographer just knows they don't take a picture of that specific thing. So our gardens don't need to be perfect. Don't beat up on yourself. If it's not to be expected, and that's not realistic. And thinking this way is liberating, more fun, and much more interesting. So this is that same bird bath that I showed surrounded by wildflowers. That's what this area looks like in late summer and early fall with all of this bird seed. Now, I am in the middle of urban Pomona, Southern California, not a kind of real wildfire danger area. Obviously, if you're living in the urban wildland interface somewhere, you wouldn't leave this much standing dried material. But for us, even this, and especially if you see it in person with all of the details of the little spent flower heads of all the different species, is very beautiful. Not something you'd see in a glossy magazine. Doesn't matter. And it brings so much life to the garden. And then all of those seeds, a lot of stuff comes up again the next year. Eventually, before the next rainy season, we come through with an electric string trimmer and just kind of turn that all into mulch right there in the ground. So through embracing this, all of this becomes based in a much larger world of natural science. And you don't need to go super deep into it. You don't need to become a scientist. But instead of just thinking about making it pretty, and it will be pretty if you work through this kind of approach, by basing it in that, it really gives us a way to start to root our designs and actions in the garden, which can provide us with a plan. So we will explore that. But instead of just thinking, how am I going to turn this into a beautiful space? It gives us a way to work through it. That gives our gardens a true sense of place and depth that conventional gardens just trying to be beautiful never really achieve. And all of this makes gardening success easier. It's not just about beating up on yourself when, it turns out that the plant dies, but based in all of this, it's really a dynamic system. And if something goes wrong, if there's a disturbance, you kind of learn from it, you get greater insight, and you move on. But where do we start with all of this to go from, okay, great, we have these kind of amorphous concepts, but I need to design a garden for my yard. So where do we start? One of the big ideas. We don't start here. We don't start at the nursery. We don't even start at a really good specialty nursery like this picture from a plant sale at the California Botanic Garden, even with great staff that knows a lot about plants and can make good recommendations, because we need to know what we want before we can even rely on somebody else to help us with the plant selection or select those plants ourselves. When you hit the nursery, even for people who know a lot about plants, if you're designing a new area, when you start at the nursery, what you often end up with is a hodgepodge. You go for these impulse buys. Sometimes you'll buy something because it has a really beautiful flower, and then you'll get home and realize, well, I don't really have room for a 10-foot wide shrub, or I don't really actually have that much full sun left anymore in my yard. It's mostly partial shade, and I bought all this stuff for full sun. So you want to go in with a plant. And if you're starting to think about California native design, let's back way up and start with some inspiration. So for me, I find a lot of inspiration in our local wild areas. So one of them is the San Gabriel Mountains. And let me be clear, I don't particularly want my back or front yard to look this wild, but there's so much we can learn here. And I want to show you some pictures from a walk I took a number of years ago during our last, really deep in the middle of the drought, when we had very little rain for a number of years. Hopefully we're not heading there quite again, but we are headed into another drought. That's just part of the cycle. So in the middle of a drought where it had hardly rained for a number of years, went out in August up above, it's kind of called the Upper Arroyo area, up above Pasadena, kind of up above JPL area for any of you who know that area, and took some pictures. I wanted to see in the middle of this historic drought, in areas that haven't had any water, what looks good out there, what's keeping itself alive with no work from humans, and what's surviving just fine. And one of the things that I find very inspiring about working with these plants that truly want to live here is that even in our latest significant drought, there have been periods of time in the plant and the geologic record that have been far drier, mega droughts than anything we've had to deal with recently. And yes, individual plants suffer and even plant communities suffer, but the plants themselves have evolved to be able to live through that. And so with a little bit of cultivation, a little bit of extra help from our yards, these seem like great plants to kind of start with as the baseline to then take the most beautiful ones, the ones that have the best habitat value, and arrange them in cultivated gardens in our yards. And so important patterns to note as we're going to quickly walk through this. Let's look at plant density and also what's on the ground as we look in these different areas. So as I was starting my walk, first thing, and this is with reflected heat along an asphalt service road, is California coffeeberry. And look, in this super dry reflected heat area, how relatively lush this wild growing plant is. That's a great one for yards, even if you don't like that native look. California fuchsia, not in bloom yet. And even during this drought, seedling oaks coming up and looking pretty happy. Have beautiful seed plumes of mountain mahogany. And because it's highly toxic, not that often used in native landscapes, but absolutely gorgeous and a good habitat plant, datura, looking absolutely beautiful. And up on slopes, just growing in cracks of rocks. Here is a Laurel Sumac, beautiful green shrub, facing west, full blasting afternoon sun, in a little crack, looking like this. Native asters with purple flowers. Here's a young toyon, one of my favorite native plants that can also be pruned up into a small tree for home gardens. Habitat powerhouse. Here, sugar bush. And California buckwheat, another kind of real backbone, super tough, can take some water, can take it super dry, can take some shade, can take full blasting sun plant, looking great in the middle of this drought. Here's some California fuchsia in full sun, coming into bloom. And then you hit the shade with a native oak woodland. And most of the grasses underneath here are non-native annual introduced grasses, but this is the place to be in August on a hot day. If we want to spend time outside in our yards in inland Southern California, have to build in some shade. And even if you don't have room for a whole oak tree, there are ways to do that with other smaller native plants, especially some of the big shrubs that can be pruned up into small trees. But if you have room to plant an oak tree, do it. It's a somewhat long-term investment, but if you're going to be at your house for 15, 20 years, or for the next person, you will get that shade. And it's just the number one wildlife habitat plant you could plant for all sorts of birds, butterflies, and other critters. Manzanita. This is big berry manzanita, looking gorgeous. Look at that beautiful new growth, that beautiful bark in the middle of the drought. And even sometimes seedlings like this California sagebrush seedlings coming up. And so things you will have noticed in this, hopefully, looking at plant density. We are dry, but we are a Mediterranean climate here. We are not the true desert in most of coastal to inland Southern California. But even if you are in the true desert, what you don't see are landscapes like we often are starting to see in the suburbs, where it's like a sea of gravel and just a couple of plants here and there, or a sea of wood chip mulch and a few plants here and there. There's a pretty high plant density. There are plants that don't need a lot of water, but we can have kind of pretty well grown gardens that don't require a whole lot of water, and we can have a plant density and a lushness to them. One important thing. Also important thing to notice. A lot of the chaparral, real chaparral kind of plants, the drier kind of shrubs growing in full sun, tend to have kind of rocks or just the decomposed granite soil of this area as the main ground covering, with bits of organic matter that have accumulated here or there. This happened to be at the edge of more of a woodland area, and our woodland areas have a pretty good layer of organic matter from oak trees and other things that have grown and died over the seasons. And so eventually we're going to talk about that when we talk about how to mulch our gardens. And so with that as the inspiration, This is rapidly bringing us to wanting to start with an understanding of our plant communities. Whether or not we're actually going to emulate a specific plant community in our yard, it's good to understand the concept of our different plant communities and different ecosystems to understand how you might group plants in our yards, both for what's going to make them thrive and as well for kind of having a coherent look or a concept. So in Southern California, where we are, our area is not a desert. Some people here might be in a true desert, but most of us are in a Mediterranean climate. There are not many Mediterranean climates in our world. A Mediterranean climate is defined by having a hot, dry summer and a cool, wet winter. And not all of our winters are wet, but if we do get rain in the Mediterranean climate, most of it is going to be in the cool season. That is very unique. And so our plants specifically are adapted to that. And that is a big part of why it's so great to grow our California native plants, but it's also a big part of why a lot of our other successful low water landscape plants come from other Mediterranean climates, like the Mediterranean itself, like the aloes from South Africa, and some of our other Mediterranean climate plants, and like some of those plants from Australia. Those are a number of our Mediterranean similar climates. And so that's kind of a lot of those adaptations. For those of us in hot inland areas, our true desert plants do grow very well, especially where we have those urban heat island areas where we have like reflected afternoon heat next to a driveway in full sun. I love growing desert plants there because a lot of those desert plants with a little supplemental irrigation, especially some of the flowering shrubs, will turn all of that heat into more flowers when some of our local plants might be done with flowering for the season. So we can mix them in, but our local, where we are here in inland Southern California, ecosystem types are oak woodland, worth emulating if we want some shade. Look at that ground cover and mixture of that wood in there. And that can create some lush soil over time that those woodland plants want. Up more on the slopes in full blasting sun, we have our chaparral. But even for this dry soil type, look at that plant density. So we don't need to have huge, huge areas of nothing in between our plants in our yard. The combination of rocks, small plants, and beautiful moments. Here's a clematis growing on a dead branch. There's different types of chaparral, different rock types. This is another area in the San Gabriel Mountains, this lighter rock type, different dominant plants. Here we have yuccas, white sages, and buckwheats. Or a little bit farther back into the San Gabriel Mountains, a little bit higher elevation, look at all that ceanothus, and then we're starting to get into pine territory as well. Mountain mahogany, just beautiful moments. And I'm mixing in a few images now of native plant landscapes that I did the planting design for that are kind of emulating some of those ideas. So this is kind of an emulation of a chaparral area. We needed the landscape to be a little bit lower in this area in the front, but still a kind of basic combination of a low growing sage with a low growing sagebrush. So working with those chaparral plants and then some grasses in the back, and then kind of a oak slash chaparral in the background. It's kind of working with that shrubbiness of the different colorful chaparral plants, and then with a non-native Mediterranean hedge kind of enclosing it and giving it a little bit more structure, which is something that's useful if there needs to be some amount of formal look, and then that could kind of, you can play with the wildness. Personally at home, I just go for the wildness and don't really worry about the formal aspects. Oak Savannah is a really, really inspiring place for me to visit. This is at the Santa Rosa Plateau. Oak Savannah is similar to oak woodland, but an oak Savannah has the tree layer, but then there's more open space in between. And at Santa Rosa Plateau, it happens to be some of our best, most intact native grassland, and then all sorts of flowering shrubs and seasonal wildflowers and some bulbs in between. To me, this is just absolutely, absolutely gorgeous. And here is a picture of a project from landscape architect Bernard Traynor, obviously very high-end property, but the garden itself is relatively humble and just embraces the plantings, the natural beauty of oak trees, native grasses. There's some yarrow in here, and then a few other shrubs starting to grow in. So that is something that can be achieved on a low budget if you're not worried about the fancy, rock walls and patio area. Here is just a little spot from essentially I did the same thing in between existing fruit trees in the backyard of a place that I used to rent. And so native grass, and this is blue-eyed grass, which is actually kind of an iris relative in the front, and then a bulb native ranunculus growing in between the grass in the back. And then riparian areas that are seasonally wet can be very beautiful and lovely, and especially looking at the riparian areas and how they transition to the drier areas. This was the hike I was on in San Diego County. But especially if we work with a seasonal water source, like maybe the gray water from a washing machine, we can set up our own little riparian areas. And some of them, to work with some of those plants, don't require a ton of extra water. I also work with plants from riparian areas around the edges of my irrigated zones of fruit trees in my backyard, which is going to have that kind of wetter soil. So instead of just mulch and fighting the weeds underneath the fruit trees, we grow all sorts of native plants, and a number of them from the riparian areas brings a lot of beneficial insects, which helps with the fruit trees as well, makes the area much more beautiful. Here's a riparian-inspired landscape design that I did with young trees growing in. You see the different grasses and rocks. So once you start to understand the plant communities of where you are, wherever you are in California, there's a couple of different ways you can start to think of them as the basis for your design. Here's kind of two approaches that are both viable. You can decide on a concept or a feel you want to achieve, and then match that to a plant community. Do you want it to be a sunny area with lots of color? That might be like working with chaparral and native sage scrub, coastal kind of plantings. Or do you want it to be a shady oasis for the summer? Maybe you're thinking about a woodland area, even if you don't have room for a big oak tree, some way to provide shade with some smaller trees, and maybe some of those understory plantings that can take the part shade. And then figure out those best plants to meet your goals that are part of that plant community. Emulating a specific plant community, especially if you do some hikes in that community, find the plants that you think are the most beautiful, do some research and see if they'll grow well in your garden, can be almost a surefire way to be successful aesthetically from a design standpoint. The plants are usually going to look pretty good together, and horticulturally, they'll be, you can take care of them well together, water them well together when you do need to water. Or you can fall in love with a bunch of plants and design them into the right spaces, kind of creating your own custom plant community, but kind of thinking about the concept of a plant community, realizing you're not just putting a bunch of plants in the ground, but you're building your own community. So what are going to be the taller plants? What are going to be the plants that work well in the shelter underneath them? Research the sun requirements, the water requirements, and focus on the concept of putting the right plant into the right place, assembling your own custom community. That's lots of fun as well. It's a way that you can kind of build your plant collection if you're someone who likes to have a high amount of plant diversity, but without having it be kind of very chaotic. If you're thinking about, well, if it's going to feel good like the kind of plant community that I want, I'm still going to have some structural plants for, sun, the areas underneath them, some very sunny areas with reflected heat. I'll need to build in something into the community that does well with that. Kind of thinking that through to develop your plant list before you hit the nursery. And so we can assemble our own resilient, coherent landscapes by using the concept of plant communities in our design. And you can base them on local native species or any combination of plants that have similar needs in your garden. So for example, like I mentioned, my fruit tree zone is a novel plant community where the trees are fruit trees, and then I'm matching other native plants that are going to grow underneath them to those kind of main requirements of the fruit trees. And we create what we call our orchard ecosystem. So here is an example of a picnic area that I designed at the Huntington Library and Botanic Gardens based on a native oak woodland. We wanted it to grow in and be shady for the picnic area, but also knew that for the first number of years, there's not going, the oak trees are here. It's going to take quite a while to grow in. And so it's going to be very sunny. So we can't really plant the plants that are one day going to grow in the shade underneath the oak trees. Some will transition. And so if you're planting a woodland for the first number of years, you're going to have some areas of full sun where you might be thinking more of a transition, like a chaparral, coastal sage scrub, the kind of plant communities that you would see at the edge of a woodland. Lots of our shrubby, colorful flower California native stuff. And so this is February 2015, our plant layout day after the kind of bones of the garden had gone in. And this is August of the same year. So stuff really does get going. There's a few California native plants that are going to kind of not grow very fast the first couple of years and then eventually kind of really get going. But a lot of our native, especially our grasses and our smaller shrubs, really just get going right away. And so here's kind of the more of the open kind of chaparral plants in between, and the oak trees starting to grow in. Some narrow leaf milkweed. So monarch butterflies showed up right away, native asters, and same thing, even with professional gardeners, you always lose a few plants. Don't beat up on yourself about it. It just always happens. So move on. But the idea is by really thinking about right plant, right place, doing a great job on your installation, selecting and buying good quality plants, the losses will be very minimal. But if you plant a whole garden, you're probably going to lose, a couple of things. If you're interested in that whole installation process, we're not going to talk about that today. We have too much to talk about with design, but later on in the season, we are going to be doing, in the fall, actually, we're going to be doing installation and establishment of California native and water-wise gardens. And from the past time I taught that class, there is already a recording of that on our YouTube channel. Right now is a great time to be thinking about design in the summer, but you don't want to do your planting or installation until late fall, if you can, at the earliest. In our landscape transformation basics class, we kind of go through the whole schedule, but right now I'll be thinking design, killing turf if you want to, any large scale like moving of dirt you can be doing later in the summer. Thanksgiving to around New Year is really kind of the sweet spot for planting in Southern California. So off and getting going. So some of the plants like this native aster will transition into the part shade. Other ones like some of the sages are going to eventually, once it's shady, be removed. And so that's just another example. Now, going forward, we're going to look mostly at residential gardens, things that might be more applicable to you at home. Another idea for guiding this is consider creating a story or a concept for your garden. So here are the concepts for me and my partner's garden at home. Our front yard is based on a native woodland, or again, will be when things grow in a little bit more. So woodland with some kind of sunny edge areas. Our whole house, because our whole yard surrounding our house is habitat plantings, our house is a bird blind. We set up where we put different features, different specific plants, and especially bird baths and things like this, this branch that we dug into the ground and set up as a perch to specifically be able to see the birds that come to our yard from inside our house, because they will spend more time in the yard when we are not out there. If you sit calmly for a while, they'll come around, and it depends on the species of bird, how timid they are. But a lot of the bird action we get to see is from inside the house. And then our backyard is a native plant collection. We try to toe the line between having a huge diversity of plants. We are both kind of horticulture people, so we are also, as part of our kind of ongoing professional education, are always trying different plants and seeing how they do. But our backyard is a native plant collection, which we work very hard to make it also look like a nice garden, even though we have a lot of one plant of this, one plant of that, and that's not the easiest way to have a coherent looking garden. We work very hard to do that. An orchard meadow and our vegetable garden. And if gardens are also habitat for people, they need space for people. Gardens need an entrance, some place for you to walk around in, and paths and other features that define planted areas. And it also just depends on what your goals are. So for example, my front yard, we don't have much of that because we don't spend a lot of time inhabiting our kind of awkwardly shaped front yard, but in our backyard, definitely. And you will want to plan for eventually when you do need to walk through your garden and do some maintenance. So in my front yard, we have an area of low herbaceous yarrow that I can walk over to get around, but we don't go out there very often to do maintenance. And so we didn't leave a permanent path. Where for our backyards, we have permanent paths And there's lots of different ways to set those up, and we will look at that in the future. But don't forget the space for you when you're thinking about the space for plants and all of the other things you're trying to accomplish. And so let's pause right here and take a look at questions that have come in. And again, for those of you who joined us after the beginning, I'm going to be answering specific questions of like, I have this plant, what do I do with it, at the very end of the workshop, and any questions about the content of what I'm presenting as we go. And there are actually no questions right now about that general content, so type them into the Q&A. And again, for those of you who are just joining us, with large workshops like this, we currently have 83 people in the workshop. I don't call on raised hands because we find that there's a lot of downtime and issues with the audio. So please type your questions into the Q&A function. There's a button in your Zoom interface that says Q&A. You can click on it and then type your question in there. Okay, so let's then keep going. And we are going to now take a look at some of the basic elements of landscape design to be considered through the lens of working with native plants. Take a quick sip of water. So the first one to be thinking about, and definitely before you think about your plant selections and definitely for planting, is landform. When you're looking at an area, are you going to be needing to do any digging or moving of dirt? What is going to be your purpose in doing that? So for example, this is my backyard. And when we moved into the place, it had a gentle slope through the whole yard from this kind of patio elevation all the way down. We also had lots of issues with water because of that gentle slope pooling up against the front of the house when it rains. And so we set up a series of rainwater harvesting features to get water around to the side of the yard, and then through, this is an in-process picture, through a series of kind of dry stream bed infiltration areas, and then eventually down here at this meadow of native Western meadow sedge, which grew in and can take flooding when it rains, but also is just a nice kind of little sunken grassy meadow area to sit and read a book underneath some shade that's grown in and spend some time on a warm day during the dry season. By digging that out, that gave us the extra soil to fill in this area to make room for a flat patio space here and this basically flat terrace, and enough of a grade break that we could have this bench made out of broken concrete to sit there with feet in the grass. And so setting up all of that with landform, that creates a number of opportunities. It creates different flat areas and sloped areas, and then these lower areas, which stay a little bit cooler, were set up to hold more water, and especially in the rainy season, definitely hold on to more moisture. And so because we're setting all of that up, the concept for what's happening in these different areas and the plants we're going to choose are a little bit different as well. If you're someone who has heavy clay soil and you don't have good drainage, and you want to grow some of our native plants that require good drainage, the opposite might be very valuable. You might have areas that you dig down because you want to capture some water, and then you set up some taller mounded areas that are going to have much better drainage where you can grow some of those selected plants that want good drainage. If you have clay soil, there are plenty of native plants that are just fine with clay soil, and we will talk about where to do some of that research later. I did just see one question come in that I will answer. There was a request for a written list of the plants. Someone's writing down, but might not have heard them all correctly. So it's farther up in the chat, and you can take a look at it. There's a couple of website links. If you joined us after the beginning, this workshop is going to be recorded and posted after a week or so. I find some time to do some light editing, and that's going to be at cbwcd.org/YouTube. You will be able to find the recording to go over all of that. And then all of the slides for I tried to label as many of the plants as I could throughout a lot of these slides. So all of the slides are going to be available in a PDF file at cbwcd.org/presentations. And so other basic elements to consider in your landscape design. Exposure, meaning is it sunny or is it shady? is extremely important. A lot of our native plants like what's considered full sun, and some of them need partial shade, especially in hot inland climates, or a few of them need full shade. And so matching that to the actual conditions is like thing number one to help you be successful. Full sun is defined as 6 or more hours of direct sunlight hitting the area throughout most of the year. So it doesn't need to be sun up to sundown kind of sun, 6 or more hours of direct sunlight. Part shade could either be high dappled overhead shade or like sun in the morning, but then shady, from noon onward, something like that. And then if you're in an inland area and you read that something needs shade or full shade, that should be pretty much no direct sunlight in the summer, because that direct sunlight inland in the summer for plants that need shade just on one hot day can kind of burn their leaves. Microclimates are also something to consider. Those are any particularly hot or cold areas in your landscape that might require a different specific approach. So if you have an area where, like our sunken meadow, where a lot of water is going to be draining when it rains, that's going to be a little bit different area. I mentioned that hot microclimate, that reflected heat inland, where maybe you'd want to go all the way over to desert plants that can really take that heat. Or like, for example, where I am in San Bernardino County in the valleys, there's not a lot of people who have problems with cold microclimates, but I once worked with a couple who their backyard is at the base of one of the hills in Chino Hills, and they actually get quite a lot more frost because the cold air piles there and doesn't drain out in the winter than most other people in our area. So they had to actually take more caution with plants that were frost tolerant for that area of their yard. So that's what I mean by microclimate. And so here you can see another kind of wet microclimate. This is a shady area, and this is our recirculating water feature. It doesn't require much water at all, but there is in the shade just a little bit of splash that hits this area, which gives us a chance to grow some plants that like a little bit more moisture throughout the year. And here's just a picture, in that wet area that lets us grow things like this native stream orchid, which is kind of an odd native plant for a garden, but it's a perfect habitat for that. So basic elements of design, getting into the aesthetics, the things that the wildlife doesn't necessarily care about, but our eye might care about. Repetition is one of them. And so that is the idea of repeating a plant throughout a planting. And so this is just one section of a large strip of a landscape design I did, where this purple native sage kind of repeats throughout this long area, as does this black sage with the white flowers, as do some of the other plants. And so there's a lot of diversity on the other side of this, but this provides somewhat of a sense of coherence throughout the landscape. If you have a smaller landscape, you might be doing your repetition more with smaller plants, and that could be repeated groups of smaller plants or individual plants, depending on how you want to do the design. But having some repetition throughout a wider area is one of the keys to having aesthetic, just for the look of it to the human eye, a landscape that kind of seems coherent. If it's all just one of this and one of that and one of this and one of that, those landscapes tend to look very chaotic. And then repetition, kind of in a larger sense, can result in something called massing, which is a mass of mostly one plant. And so here is an area of native deer grass in full sun, but also through the understory of some of these trees. And then there were just individual accents, which can't even be seen here, planted. So a native buckwheat here, a native sage there, but relying aesthetically on the mass of the deer grass. And for certain plants, that massing also has benefits for wildlife. So for example, our small finches, especially the goldfinches, really love deer grass seeds when they're ripe. And so having an area where they can hop from plant to plant to plant without having to go far and wide, having a certain mass, and that'll work even with like 3, 5, 7 of them in a residential yard, is something that will really provide them added incentive to spend some time there. surprise, just one kind of accent plant tucked in somewhere else is always a nice thing to consider. So it doesn't always need to be masses and repetition. Sometimes that's also a single flowering shrub in one area of the yard, especially once you get into larger shrubs that oftentimes you'll be working with individual selections. But even smaller plants like this sculptural Dudleya can be a little spot of surprise in the garden. Looking at the juxtapositions of the plants themselves, texture is really important. Texture is basically the size and shape of the leaf is what's going to define a plant's texture. And contrast of texture is something that visually helps make a planting look distinct. And so for this example, we're looking at the large triangular shaped leaves of this hummingbird sage and the small ferny leaves of this yarrow, and then the kind of fountain shaped thin leaves of the deergrass. So very different textures. So even when there's no flowers, the texture, as well as the slightly different colors of the leaves, is going to provide a sense of intention with the design, as opposed to three very similar looking plants together. And then the flowers are the icing on the cake. And then color as well. We have so many different foliage, leaf colors of our native plants that we can work with color contrast in the aesthetics, the visual part of our planting designs. And then the flowers are just kind of the icing on the cake. So for my personal kind of design philosophy, I generally don't worry at all about flower color. If I'm thinking about just the pure design elements, I'm thinking more about color and texture of the plants. And then the flowers, by planting a diversity of plant material, they're just going to work themselves out and be beautiful. And that tends to work, I think, pretty well. If you really want to think about flower color, you can. But that's something where when you're thinking about season of flower color, you're thinking about the wildlife habitat, you're thinking about the visuals, you're thinking about putting the right plant in the right place. There's only so many different factors to balance. And to me, flower color is just not an important one to put into that mix, because that one tends to work itself out, where the other ones I find I want to spend my effort on being more intentional with. So here's other examples of the texture and the color. And here's example of flower color working itself out. So that's, now that it's grown in, that sunken meadow area on the right, and the stuff growing on the terrace with lots of native annual wildflowers around the shrubs as they're growing in. And so you can see here, even when the same flower color is repeated, like purple, there's so many different variations that oftentimes you still end up with some nice contrast, even if it's more subtle. So I see a lot of questions coming in. I think I'm actually going to stop and answer some questions, because the next element of the design that we're going to talk about is going to be kind of its own little thing. So let's answer some quick ones. From Roberta, are succulents native? Most of the succulents that we grow in our gardens in California are not native. Some of them are. The Dudleyas are one of the groups of native succulents. That happened to be the one that I showed. But even for people who are not necessarily like native plant purists, a lot of the succulents horticulturally, in terms of their need for water, can fit very well mixed into a native garden. So some people like to mix in succulents that are not native as ways of having some structure and sculpture throughout the year in a kind of wild or native garden. And that's a decent approach for people who feel like aesthetically they need that. So some specific questions. Let's see. From Steve, any recommendations on what to use for mounding when I mentioned mounding? So the easiest thing always is to be, if you're needing to excavate in your yard, like for example, you're digging a dry stream bed, use that same soil for the mounding. If not, then you're going to be bringing in soil from a local, or called soil yard, or sometimes they're called a landscape supply yard. They are there are ones pretty much serving almost every community in California, I believe, and most of them basically have a sandy loam topsoil that they sell, and that's what you would want to use. It gets very heavy very quickly, so usually you're going to have it delivered because even like a truck can't really carry that much usually, unless you have a really big truck with a pretty big engine. But basically soil, like you never want to use potting soil. That's just going to break down. You need some real soil. And if you're mounding and want good drainage, you're going to be looking for a sandy loam soil for your raised areas. So, okay, question from Angela about swales. I'll answer that one because it's a resource that might be useful for you. So it was a question about swales in small residential yards. Yeah, there's some other approaches as well. A French drain might be more appropriate depending on how small it is. But there is a class on our YouTube channel called Rainwater Harvesting for Home Gardens. That is all about figuring out rainwater harvesting and how to build those features for residential gardens. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. Okay, I had mentioned fall planting. So from Juliet, when planting in the fall, do you water regularly until they're established? Or will the usual rainfall during that time period be enough? Generally, with planting in the fall, for at least the first year, unless it has rained, I will default to watering good deep soak once a week for plants, at least for their first year, usually. There might be specific reasons based on observations to stretch it out a little bit more, especially if it's in shade with heavy soils. But remember, especially right after planting, even if the soil seems moist, the root ball right in the plant where the potting soil is might have dried out. So you want to keep an eye on that. Someone asked to repeat the best times for planting. For native plants generally, I think Thanksgiving to New Year is kind of the sweet spot. And then through the winter is okay. You just want to get them in on that earlier side so they can be slowly kind of rooting in through the winter. So when spring comes, they're really ready to grow, but are nicely rooted in. And then if the project timeline has to stretch, I really try to be done by the end of March, if at all possible. That being said, like when I've been involved with commercial projects, sometimes we've had to plant in June. It's just a little bit fussier in terms of really making sure things get watered enough, but not too much. And then I just know if I plant a native garden in June, I will lose a few more plants over that first year than if I planted kind of in that Maine late fall to early winter. And so all of the other questions that have come in that are more specific, if you hang out till the end of the class, I will definitely get through all of those. From Nekek, is it risky to mix different plant communities? As long as the right plant, right place requirements are being met, which is, sun, water frequency, is the soil well draining? You can definitely do it. So like I will commonly in my yards or in my projects mix a few desert plants in with chaparral plants. That's just fine, for example. I just talk about plant communities because that's a good kind of place to start. And then if you have a specific reason to mix things from different communities, that's just fine as long as it's that right plant, right place. From Deborah, what is a good time to prune? Depends on the plant, but I will provide you with the resource for that. Okay, so let's get going again, and then we'll do another round of questions before long. Okay, so the next concept is one called cues to care. And this is potentially, I think, the most useful thing that I learned in landscape architecture school, especially with working with plant types that can sometimes tend to look a little bit more on the wild side if we're thinking about our front yards. And if we are thinking about, what the neighborhood is going to think if you're putting in the first native plant front yard in your area. Acoustic Care can be something to consider. Acoustic Care is a concept that was developed by a woman named Joan Nassauer, who was a researcher, and she was a landscape psychologist. It's a very specific area of research. And basically, she was interested in why people think the way they do about different landscapes. And she became interested in a very different plant community where she was living and researching the native plant community types was more of a prairie ecosystem. And it wasn't the dominant thing, but it started to become a little bit more popular for people to take out their lawns and do prairie restoration front yard landscapes. And the result of those was very polarizing. In some plantings, neighborhoods and neighbors thought they were beautiful and was like really a great thing to do. And then in some instances, the neighbors thought this person has just left their yard to become overgrown and go to weeds, and it's lowering property values, and this should not be tolerated. And she wanted to figure out what made that difference. And so she set up a study where she showed people very similar prairie restoration front yards with just a couple of things changed. So she could study what was making that difference. And essentially, after all that research, what she found out is something pretty logical, but that we often don't necessarily take into account with our landscape designs. People will either like or at least accept and not complain about landscapes that appear to them to be intentional and cared for. And people tend to not like or be upset about landscapes that appear to be neglected and non-intentional. And what she found was that there are certain things that could be done, which she called cues to care, to let people, even if they don't have any idea what's going on with the plants, even if the plants look a little bit wild and they're new to the neighborhood, there are things that can be done to let people know, yes, this landscape is intentional. And by including those things, it went a long way towards people accepting or even liking those landscapes. So in those prairie restoration front yards, something like a nice picket fence surrounding those wild grasses and perennial flowers, something like a mown strip at the edge, was just enough to let people know, yes, this is intentional. And so, for example, in this pretty rambunctious native front yard, there's a couple of things that I see as cues to care. One of them is this sulfur buckwheat here, this yellow flowered one. This is kind of a very intentional staggering, this 1, 2, 3 grouping, which makes it very much look like an intentional planting design. But beyond that, this brick walkway is well maintained. It's not uplifted. There's not a bunch of weeds right at the edge between the mulch and the walkway. Even the paint on the front of the house, this white trim, is kind of nice and clean. This does look like an intentional landscape. You can see here, this landscape has a very nicely maintained and nicely edged decomposed granite walking path, where if this path wasn't here and it was just all shrubs, then it would look a lot less inviting, even if the landscape, the planting design wasn't that different, and it would potentially look a little bit less intentional. And then this is one of my favorite examples. These are all landscapes that I took pictures of on the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour a number of years ago. So this is a garden in Van Nuys, California. So very similar climate and soils to the area where I am in now. And think about being a neighbor who doesn't know anything about native plants and walking past this landscape like this, which is a pretty rambunctious garden. I love the look. But think about how this would look if this fence, the split rail fence, wasn't there, if these intentional looking piles of rocks weren't there, and if it was just the plant material itself. It would look a lot more wild and a lot more rambunctious. And so when someone then walks by and they see, and this nicely maintained path, the plants are trimmed so they're not growing over the path, even though it's a pretty wild looking planting, the piles of rocks, this all becomes a very intentional looking landscape, even though it's embracing the kind of wild look. And there are ways to have your native landscape look less wild if that's what you want. But I really love the way that this yard kind of balanced all of that. And so that, in a nutshell, is Acoustic Care. And I think it can go a long way in front yard landscapes. There's also a few different yard signs that are easily available if you're working with California native plants to let the neighbors know what you're doing, or the people in the neighborhood. So the California Native Plant Society, as a little kind of fundraiser thing, has a cool little metal yard sign that says native plants grow here, that we have displayed at the entrance of our driveway. And also, if you are doing the wildlife habitat sort of thing through the National Wildlife Federation, you can have your yard certified as a wildlife habitat. It's a pretty easy process. If you have food, cover, which is just some amount of dense plant material where especially like birds or lizards can hang out and be safe, water, some sort of water feature, bird bath, a place to raise young, you can do that certification. And by doing that, it's not super expensive. It helps support their programs, and you get a cool sign that says that your yard is certified wildlife habitat, which can also kind of let people know what's going on with this non-traditional shaped garden, if that's what you're into. And so now we're going to talk more about some of the physical elements of the garden as we start to kind of build our list of things that we might all kind of integrate into our native designs. And then eventually, after that, we will get to selecting plants themselves and talking about plants themselves. So most of these pictures are taken on the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour, which happens every spring. This year it was virtual. They spend a couple of days working with different homeowners and opening up gardens for the public who sign up for that tour to see. Usually one day is in like the San Gabriel and San Fernando valleys. That's usually the day that I go to. And then one day is on the west side of LA as well, through sometimes some of the more beach areas. I try to get there if I can, but the inland gardens, I think, are really relevant to the area that I am currently working. And so here are some different garden elements that might appeal to you to integrate. You can work with native plants with kind of working on something that more emulates a traditional lawn and shrubs rather than a naturalistic landscape like some of the ones we've been looking at. And so instead of the lawn here, there's a Yarrow Lawn, which is still going to be a medium water planting. You can probably be watering it once a week to once every other week, depending on the time of year. I have a spot of yarrow that I let dry out a little bit more in my yard that I water like every 3 to 4 weeks, but it doesn't look quite this good in the summer, and it's not as big. So that's still a lot less water than a standard lawn. It's green a lot of the year, and then in the late spring, early summer, you get these beautiful flowers. And then in the back, kind of working with traditional elements like a shrub of repeated here, sage, here, ground cover sagebrush. This variety is called Canyon Gray. And so to achieve this look, there is a lot more pruning and clipping. This is not a low maintenance landscape, but if you like that formal look, you can achieve that with native plants and still have the water benefits and some of the wildlife habitat benefits. A more naturalistic garden will give you the maximum wildlife habitat benefit, but this is still much more useful to the wider world than a traditional like turf and roses kind of front yard. If you're working with patio and container spaces, no problem at all. There's plenty of native plants that can grow well in containers, especially if you're doing a little bit of experimentation. One quick recommendation is if you are growing native plants in containers, work with cactus mix as your potting soil. That has just that little bit of extra drainage that native plants appreciate. Patio spaces, definitely. Again, don't forget those people spaces. And if you're working with a naturalistic native plant look, you can achieve a look that I think is really awesome for patio spaces, which also is less expensive to install than a paved patio and allows rainwater when it's falling to infiltrate right where it lands and not wash off and have to be dealt with elsewhere by working with kind of natural materials. So here it's an example of a pea gravel patio, which looks great. It can just sweep right into a little bit of the mulch layer, ground cover layer underneath the plants. Really nice and simple. or a decomposed granite patio, which is that compacted kind of light tan colored, it's not soil, it's not sand, decomposed granite is what it is. And it is also permeable, makes it a nice walking surface. You see that more and more as like walking surfaces and pathways in public parks these days. Here is decomposed granite path edged with natural river rock, this kind of meadowy native front yard. Here it is again, also with river rock, but kind of larger boulders, a little bit more naturalistic through this shady side yard. Or working with pavers and gravel in between, again, allowing things to be permeable. Gravel pathways, or working with recycled broken concrete. A driveway needs to come up, an old broken concrete patio that can be repurposed. That is something that you can do yourself if you're dedicated to doing it. The concrete is pretty heavy. It is a decent amount of physical work, but it is a potential project. And I show kind of the process of setting up a broken concrete patio in our installation and establishment of native plant and water-wise landscapes class. I really like this balance in this yard of the rectilinear kind of very modern pattern of the pavers with the decomposed granite mulch in between, and then just kind of washing that, continuing to work with the decomposed granite mulch into this more wild native landscape. I think, again, that contributes to that Acoustic Care, and it can be very wild and playful and still aesthetically very strong for a front yard because of this more formal element, if you're looking to kind of work that balance. Other kind of combinations of flagstone with decomposed granite in between. Pavers, which can be very affordable just from the local hardware store. Or just mulch. So here we have mulch with then some branches that had been left over from a tree trimming used for edging. And this is the approach that I use in most of my backyard. And in a lot of my gardens, it's just the gap between the plants is where the pathway is. And if you're looking for a naturalistic way of doing things, and especially if where the pathways might change one day, that's a great way of setting it up, and the price is right. And then also thinking about rainwater capture as you're starting to think of all of these different elements. Are there ways where you can take the water, especially coming off of like your roof or your driveway, and really make sure that you turn that into a resource, hopefully capture as much as possible of it on your property? So we've talked some about dry stream beds. If you are interested, if you currently have a lawn and you're interested in putting a native landscape in there and you're in Southern California, there are the turf replacement rebates available through SoCalWatersmart.com, Metropolitan Water District, and your local water provider. And you're required to do some sort of water capture feature as part of meeting those landscape requirements. We talk about that more in the Landscape Transformation Basics class that I teach once a month in the evening from 6 to 8:30 p.m. You can sign up for an upcoming class if you want to do that live and ask questions. We also have the recording of that class on our YouTube channel. So here are just some different examples of versions of that water capture, or even thinking about areas, again, making sure that the landscape areas stay permeable, and then anything additional can go into a small dry stream bed. Can be very naturalistic, or can be pretty formal with like a gravel-filled trench, which is what's called a French drain. One tip for achieving a really nice look doing this is work with your local natural rock wherever you are. For most of Southern California, that's largely a granite mixed rock. Reasons why is, one, it looks the most natural. Two, that's what you can get at different sizes, and mixing different sizes from smaller gravels to small boulders, everything in between, is a key to achieving a natural look, where those quote ornamental rocks and gravels usually can't get all the different sizes. It also happens to be a lot cheaper, usually about a third of the cost of the other quote more ornamental material. Or you can get even more creative. So like the cat run through the garden at the Gottlieb Native Plant Garden. So get as creative as you want, but those are the sorts of elements that as you're thinking about the layout of your garden and how you're going to use your space as a human, that you are often going to be thinking about before, again, you're thinking about individual plant species, especially for like backyard kind of spaces. Because for example, if you are looking at a 2,000 square foot backyard as a blank slate, it's pretty intimidating to start thinking about the plants for all of those different areas. But if you realize, okay, I'm going to have a gravel patio space over here, and I'm going to need a pathway that goes through my back door that goes through my area there, and then I need a pathway that also goes off towards where my fruit trees are. As you think about those goals and priorities for how you're going to use your space, whatever those goals and priorities are that are best for you, you are going to start subdividing your larger space into smaller areas between those important functions for you. Once you have those areas, you can really start in more detail to think about the plants. So you're going to have a patio space. If you're in Southern California and you're going to want to use that patio space in the early evening in the summer, you're going to want to put something to cast some shade on that in the early evening, late afternoon, which means you're going to have a large shrub or a tree on the west side of that patio space. Once you have that, you can start thinking about the plants that you're going to group around that. Having an area that you know the path is going to go through, so the area is going to be maybe 200 square feet, and you're going to have a few shrubs and then some smaller flowering perennials along the edge of the pathway, is a lot easier to think about than just looking at a 2,000 square foot blank slate. So once you figure out that basic plan, you can start to think about plants. Now then, depending on what you want to do with the plants, you might kind of push and pull. You might realize you really want this one shrub here, so the pathway is going to scoot a little bit. And that's the process of going through design. Usually your first drawing of where you might want to put your different elements is going to shift some. It's all kind of negotiable. But by starting with those concepts and then working the plants in and then shifting everything till it all kind of feels nice and balanced to you, that's going to help you be a lot more successful in meeting your goals, whatever those goals are for your landscape, than hitting the nursery, even if you're hitting a great nursery before you're thinking about those design elements. And so with that, let's look at, see if any more general questions have come in. A couple of good ones. And then we will talk about choosing plants. So from Robert, do I plant first and then put down the gravel or the mulch, or vice versa? I would say it depends on the project and depends on what's going to work best for you. Generally, if it's a new project, I'm going to plant first and then put down the mulch layer, whether it's wood chips or gravel or decomposed granite after that. It's just easier if you're doing a large project, because the digging up of the soil as you are planting just tends to get soil all over the place. It's really easy to just kind of smooth out and rake if your mulch layer has not gone down yet, but you have to be much more careful if it has. And so it's just easier. If you have put down gravel first and then you're adding, just have like a nice wide bucket or a tub, or lay down a tarp or something like that to keep your dirt as isolated from the ground covering, whether it's wood chips or gravel or whatever. So either one can work, but a little bit easier to plant first in general. And from Simone, where do you buy native plants? Are there specific nurseries? Absolutely. Good question. So you generally can't just go to your local nursery and expect them to have a good selection of native plants. Some of the more mainstream nurseries, like for example, Armstrong, at least the one nearby me in Claremont, is starting to have a better native plant selection. But if you're designing a whole garden, they're not going to have everything that you're looking for. So you want to find who the local specialty nurseries are. At the end of this presentation, there's a slide with the local nurseries in the general kind of wider Los Angeles area that I know are carrying a good selection of native plants. Additionally, at the website where you can download the PDF of this whole presentation, which is farther up in the chat, cbwcd.org/presentations, you can download a local landscape suppliers list where the soil yards and the places to get like irrigation equipment and stuff is really local towards where I am located kind of at the western edge of San Bernardino County because those areas are kind of distributed. Those businesses are distributed all over the place, but the nurseries are kind of more general for Los Angeles area. If you are not in the Los Angeles area, there is another resource, which I will show in just a second. Okay, and I am seeing a number of questions coming in on the chat. A lot of them happen to be more specific, but just a reminder, please send those in on the Q&A because I see those all much more effectively in my interface when I am keeping an eye on the Q&A. And Jordan had a question about habitat. We will get to that later in the presentation. So for choosing plants, I want to share just a couple of resources with you. And I am going to show you a couple of websites. The first one I'm going to show you, and this is I think really useful if one, you're in inland valley areas, but the plants are relevant for most of California. And two, if you're really just kind of getting started with native plants. This is our Inland Valley Garden Planner website that our agency has created. It is about to get a major facelift and a lot of information, not just about plants, but about landscape design and recommended plant palettes, a whole bunch of new content, which should be going up within about a month or so. So definitely check back at inlandvalleygardenplanner.org, and especially related to design. We're going to have a lot of great new content for you. But a couple of different resources, one of which, if choosing your plants all feels very overwhelming to you and you're just getting started, you can go directly to the section called Garden Styles. And here are a number of different pre-selected plant palettes. And the top three, as well as the meadow garden, or sorry, the top four as well as the meadow garden are mostly California native plants: butterfly and songbird garden, pollinator garden, California native color, focused on having blooms throughout the year, which also provides a lot of resources for pollinators, but just really focused on color throughout the year, woodland type ecosystem, and meadow. And so for all of those, these are pre-selected palettes of plants that are, again, you're going to want to go to a specialty nursery, but pretty common to find. No real kind of specialty or rare stuff on these. All of them pretty easy to grow and really selected to work well together. Still look at the right plant, right place, because we have some that are more for the shady area of your yard, some for the full sun areas, but that's a place to start. And then each of these plants has a detailed profile, which includes, for inland Southern California, a irrigation schedule for how often these plants are going to want to be watered and how much. If you're in a more coastal area, you just might be able to get away with watering a little bit less. And then the important information for working with the design, and as well as right plant, right place. Height, width, it should be expected to get. Flower season, the soil. So is it tolerant of clay soil if you have slower draining soil? The exposure, so the sunlight it wants. And then for all of these plants, eventually you're going to need to know how to maintain them. So we have a maintenance section for all these plants. The vast majority of them are quite easy to maintain. However, you're going to need to know the specifics. So a lot of them just get cut back once or maybe twice a year. But what time of year do you do it? Oftentimes that's right before it's going to push its main growth for the season, which with native plants could be at different times of the year. So you want to make sure you do that at the right time of year. Some of them, for example, like hummingbird sage, I have a little bit of extra detail I've put in for what to do the first year to really get it off to a good start. So just because there's a lot of words doesn't mean the actual work to do is complicated. And every plant has that maintenance entry. And so that's the information. But for most people, the real heart of the website, clicked the external link by accident. For most people, the real heart of the website, going from the homepage, is the plant finder, where you can query, I want a California native plant. There's 114 California native plants. So there's a lot more available, but we chose just the ones that are kind of the most reliable, easiest to find, and beginning gardeners are likely to be successful with them. So the ones we would recommend the most. Say you have a full sun space and you want it to be, you're trying to select a shrub and you happen to have slower draining soil and you want it to be a butterfly plant. Well, from then all those plants you could possibly grow from our close to 120 top selections, then you're down to 11 top choices, and you can take a look at them, the size, all the other right plant, right place, and get recommendations. So that's the Inland Valley Garden Planner. If you want a more inclusive look at potential native plants to grow in your yard, which has all sorts of native plants, stuff that are rare, stuff from more specialty nurseries, then you want to take a look at Kellscape, which is a project of the California Native Plant Society. There's a couple of things that you can do. One thing that's interesting to do is you can enter an address or a zip code in California to see plants native to that location. That will return a lot of fascinating results. As a garden designer, though, a lot of those results might be plants that are very difficult to grow in home gardens, especially if you have only been growing California native plants for a few years or are new to it. And also a lot of those plants that come back might be very interesting, but might be very hard or not available at all in nurseries. If you are looking for information about a native plant by name, you can type that in. But what I recommend for most people is actually going to the advanced search and then working with some of the other factors. So for example, you can do shrub, you can do full sun, you can do your drainage. So let's say we have fast, you want low water requirement, but for gardeners, then you can choose ease of care, because some of the other native plants are not that easy to care for. Everything on the Inland Valley Garden Planner, we pre-selected for things that are easy to care for. So for a beginning gardener, you might just choose very easy to care for. And then for availability in nurseries, usually you'll want to do commonly available. And then if you want to, you can also do, I think you can also include your area. Yeah, so native to, you can do, for example, 91763. So if I wanted to find local native plants that meet all of those requirements, then you could search. And out of the thousands of plants that they have requirements for that do all of those things with my slow draining soil and the very easy, that's down to 28. And you can have it be a little bit wider. Example, like for my yard, I definitely don't only do plants that are native to my area. So you can definitely be more inclusive, and you can work with all of those factors as much as you want, but then you can, make sure still that you're putting in plants that are pretty easy to grow. And then also when you put those plants in, not every nursery that carries native plants has participated in this, but a lot of the nurseries that grow these plants have participated in this program. And you can see when you pull up a plant, what nurseries potentially carry that plant. So that's another way to find the nurseries that are going to be carrying that. Also, California Native Plant Society has local chapters throughout most of California. Get involved with your Native Plant Society chapter, or most of them have Facebook groups, so you don't even necessarily need to join, although that's a great idea. But you can go to their Facebook page and ask, hey, in our area, what are the best places to buy native plants? And you can find out from there. So that's kind of some basics for choosing plants. Just going to mention a few other big aspects related to choosing plants. Then we'll take our quick break and go from there. So for choosing plants, one of the things you're going to want to do is tune into our seasons where we are and understand that as part of the design, and really even celebrate that as part of the design. So for example, I'm about to do some little bit of fall cleanup pruning for this California buckwheat plant, but these dried flowers, this kind of dark bronzy brown, is part of what's wonderful about this plant. So from a more traditional kind of gardening standpoint, that might be seen as, oh, the flower is dry, you have to deadhead. That's not the case. And even through some of our plants that do go a little bit dry, like some of our native grasses in the summer, tuning into that seasonal cycle and understanding that as part of the beauty of it, and seeing the details, and that when some of the plants that do get dry, like the color is not all the same. There's all sorts of different yellows to golds to browns, and there's a lot of contrast there as well. You can think about that as part of the design and embrace and enjoy that, as I do in some parts of my yard. Or you can just decide that you want really to work with plants that are going to look good and evergreen for more of the year, and focus on that. So for example, there are parts of my front yard where I intentionally chose plants that are going to be evergreen, great native habitat plants that have more of a traditional look, because I put in the first native plant front yard in the neighborhood. And also the plants are great for those other qualities that I needed. And I'll show you that in our design example later on. Or you can fully embrace the seasons. I encourage you to embrace the seasons in at least part of your yard. Native plants are mostly easy to grow, but require a little bit of learning and a different approach. And a lot of that approach is just to be more hands-off and do a little bit less. So that's a good thing. So that's the basics with plant selection. I am not in this workshop going to go through plant by plant. I like this plant, I like that plant, I like this plant, because your situation, your goals, the process that's going to get you there is going to be very different. However, I do want to mention that on our YouTube channel, we do have a whole class that is favorite plants for Inland Valley Gardens, which I mentioned earlier. The vast majority of those are native plants, where I do exactly that. And then for those of you who are going to download the slides, I also have slides with images of my favorite kind of, like, if I'm just going to do a native plant garden design for someone who's just getting started, the basic favorite plants that I would use as that default plant palette, which are all generally easier ones to find, especially during planting season. Okay, so let's take a 5-minute break. If you need to get a glass of water, use the restroom, any of that sort of stuff. So it's 10:53 now. We have a lot to cover still. So we'll start up again at 10:58, and we will start with answering some more questions. So type in those questions if you have them during our break. Okay, we are going to get started again, starting with the questions. So I see some of them that have come in are very specific and kind of situation dependent. So again, I am happy to answer all of those to the best of my ability, but those will have to wait until noon when we finish the main workshop, and then I'm happy to stay and answer those. So let's go through some of the more general ones. Should I pull out weeds or cut them off at their base so as not to disrupt the soil? The answer to that one is kind of, it depends. Just pulling out a weed generally does not disrupt the soil that much. I mean, some amount of normal soil disruption is natural. Some plants, when you cut them off at the base, like, that'll be it. So that's great. And that might even be less work than pulling them. But some weeds will grow back. So it kind of depends on the weeds. For other general approaches of dealing with weeds, including my favorite technique if you're starting a new garden, which is cardboard mulching or sheet mulching, you can check out our Removing Your Turf the Right Way online workshop, and especially the section on cardboard mulching or sheet mulching if an area is very weedy, just to kind of get control of it to begin with. We present it there in the concept of killing grass, but it works very well for weedy areas overall. So from KB, if winter rains are few, how do we decide when, if, and how much to water for our native plants that shouldn't receive summer watering? So my general, unless I have a specific reason not to, default will be I water my native gardens after they're established about once per month in the months that it doesn't rain. So through the winter, if it's not raining or big rain's not in the forecast, I will water. If it seems like it's going to rain and I decide not to water, I will keep an eye on how much it watered. Because if it just rains a quarter of an inch, I'll still, after that, water to supplement to give it a good deep soak. I'd still probably water my full inch just because that quarter inch might not even penetrate the mulch layer. And then if we are getting to the late winter, early spring, and we haven't had much water over the winter, like this year, I will do some extra supplemental watering in March, early April to kind of catch the soil up to make the plants feel like as if it was a slightly better rain year than it actually was. And so when I say an inch of water, on the Inland Valley Garden Planner, there's some explanations of how do you figure out how much an inch of water is for your garden. And we're about to improve that section with the renovation to that website, like I mentioned. But essentially, it's like as if it rained an inch. So if you're using overhead sprinklers at all, you can put out a cat food can, tuna can that's been washed out, or a wide mouth pint mason jar, anything that's just kind of like a cylinder. And that's exactly what I do when I set up some temporary sprinklers for some of my native areas that have no permanent irrigation system. I'll put out the sprinkler, and then I'll put a few jars around. And then when there's an inch of water in those jars on average, that's when I turn it off. That's how I know I've watered an inch. So that's a quick way of doing it. If you're watering with a hose and an attachment, basically you want to figure out how long it takes to leave your hose kind of in a few spots around the base of that individual shrub on a slow trickle, so that the soil gets pretty well watered through, at least a foot down, or kind of through the root zone of that plant. Takes a good bit of like picking around and figuring it out when you're first trying to do that, but that's also a viable approach depending on the size of your area. So for example, in some of my native zones, I have areas where we don't do any overhead watering in the summer, especially because we have a few native plants that really don't want any summer water, like woolly blue curls. And so those native plants that are kind of in that same general area, like once a month-ish, I'll just kind of leave a hose on a trickle for a while and move it into like 2 or 3 spots kind of around the edge of where that shrub is. And that'll be how that gets watered. Let's see. So some other. So someone has a native plant area that gets pretty close coastal influence and coastal winds. And also if you're right there near the coast, I don't know how close you are, there's salt spray to kind of deal with. You're going to want to rely on local sources for plants that grow well on the coast. A lot of kind of lower kind of ground cover versions of things like sages, sagebrushes, coyote brush, some of the common native plants, they have lower ground cover versions that were actually selected from coastal areas subject to those winds. So you might work with those, but there are definitely, I've seen online, I'm not an expert because I don't work in the coastal area, but I've seen online articles and lists for plants that grow well in those coastal areas. I believe Las Politas Nursery, Las Politas, they have a great website with all sorts of information. I think they have some content on that. Okay, quick question about sheet mulching that I can just answer. With drip irrigation, goes below the cardboard. So generally you're going to want to drip irrigation, plant, and then put the cardboard on top of it, because the drip irrigation won't water evenly. If the water is on top of the cardboard, it'll kind of sheet off in all sorts of different directions. Eventually the cardboard breaks down enough, and with overhead water, it works itself out. But if you have a chance, sheet mulch below the cardboard for sure. Okay, so we're going to jump back into it. And then again, for those of you who had specific questions, after we get through the main presentation, I'm happy to answer all of those. And so now we're going to jump into a bit about that actual design process. So we've talked about all the elements. We've talked about kind of the nuts and bolts of selecting the plants that are going to do well for you. Now we're going to kind of talk about and give you an example walking through the process of designing a native landscape. So the first thing you're going to want to do is evaluate your site and think about the plants and features that you want to keep. Your garden, it does not have to be all or nothing with California native plants, but make sure, for example, if you have an existing tree that's in good shape that you want to keep, like you have an existing mature magnolia tree, you might not want to rip it out just because it's not native or it's a medium water tree. But if you're going to then convert the rest of your yard to California native plants, make sure you do some of that research and select some medium water use California native plants, or California native plants that can accept medium water use. And they can go in the area where that magnolia tree is also going to get watered. And then maybe you'll have a drier area that the low water California native plants can go to. And in a lot of those plant databases, you can search for native plants that are medium water. There's lots of great native plants that either are or can tolerate that if you have existing landscape that you want to keep. And then you also want to think about your goals and write them down and keep them nearby so you can kind of refer back to them. In a different design-based class that I teach, which is called Do-It-Yourself Landscape Design, we talk quite a bit more about goals and setting your goals. And so if you're really going to be designing your yard, that's another one that I only teach that usually about once a year. And that one, I'm not teaching anytime coming up. So you'd want to check that out on our YouTube channel. And that might be worthwhile as well, especially for backyard spaces where you're planning different functions. We spend a lot more time talking about that in that workshop. But so here is the example of the front yard of the current place that my partner and I live in Pomona. It was a lawn when we moved there, and we wanted to take that out and do something more interesting. And so our goals for our front yard were to have it be beautiful. We wanted to provide habitat, especially for birds and pollinators and butterflies. We wanted it to be low water. And we wanted to provide a little bit more of a sense of privacy. We're on a cul-de-sac, and the front yards are not tiny, but they're not that big. This is about 1,200 square feet of landscape area total. But with the way that the houses are on the cul-de-sac, the front yards are pretty narrow, and then the backyards are pretty wide. And so through any of the windows facing this way, like through our living room, which is right here, feels like about 4 houses are facing right towards it. And with the fact that they were all just lawns, it's kind of like a little bit of a fishbowl effect. So we wanted to provide more privacy without totally like putting up a fence or a formal hedge around the whole thing and kind of turning our back on the neighborhood. We wanted to work with some of those native plants that smell great. And so from walking to the driveway or with the screen door open in the summer, we're getting that smell of the sages and some of those other great California native plants. And then we happen to, because unfortunately the street trees that used to be in our neighborhood had a disease and died, and street trees have not been replanted in our neighborhood, we have a great view of the San Gabriel Mountains throughout a lot of the north-facing windows. And so we wanted to provide more shade and put some small trees in this small front yard, but still make sure that we preserved our view of the mountains. And so having that goal figured out and stated is going to help us remember to be careful with where we put our trees, to frame and accentuate those views, cover up what we don't want to see while leaving what we do want to see. So thinking very specifically about our goals first before we're really figuring out our design. And then coming up with just a basic base plan. This can be drawn to scale on graph paper if you want. Doesn't need to be. This one I just kind of drew out to get my ideas down. Normally I do it on paper just for getting the basics down. Here I did it digitally because I knew I was going to be sharing this. And how I normally do this, just to start getting the ideas down, is I don't draw it all out to scale yet, but I will pull up the property on Google Maps, and then I will click the button in the lower left to get to the satellite view, and I'll zoom in to where I see the area as clearly as possible. And then I'll freehand draw it. It's just my process. And then that will help me just approximate the sizes of everything well enough to get my ideas down. You can also print that out and trace it if you want, or you can take a screen capture of that and work on all of your stuff digitally. I know some people I've worked with take a screen capture and then just do like notes and basic shapes in PowerPoint. However you want to do it, whatever your process is going to be good, go for that, whatever you're comfortable with. The important thing is just having some way to get your ideas down. And so here are the basic relevant things that you're generally going to want is what's going on there and then the surround. So we just had lawns, so there are no existing plants that we were going to keep. There's a few kind of junky shrubs that we got rid of as well up against the house. The street is here. The curve is because it's the cul-de-sac. Here is our asphalt driveway, walkway up to our house, the door, the basic outline of the house, and the door and window locations, because you're going to want to be framing your views out into the landscape and thinking about that as well as being in the landscape. So definitely those window locations. Eventually I'm going to be thinking about where water comes down. So I do draw the ridge lines of the roof usually, and then anything on the neighboring property. So on this side, it was just the neighbor's lawn. Didn't really matter as much here. Made sense to put in. The neighbor just has a gravel strip right here, and then the neighbor's driveway. And so part of this also is going to be working with the privacy, but also different angles. So for example, out of this room where we have a desk right here at this window, the view with the angle, it's kind of hard to tell, but a lot of the view is just of the cars parked in the neighbor's driveway. So again, we want to be looking at garden and not just the cars in the neighbor's driveway. And then as I was kind of investigating things early on, before I started on my garden, I was doing work on the plumbing and realized that the water main had been replaced at some point in time, and they didn't do a great job digging a good trench for that. So the water main was running only 6 inches deep. So as I think about what I'm planting, or also maybe moving soil around, I wanted to get that in, because on a lot of sites, it's going to be deeper. It's not quite as relevant, but for us, because of how shallow it was going to be relevant. And then also your water meter box, because that's something that they're going to need to come and check. So you want to make sure you're not going to be growing something that's going to grow way over it, because then you'll have to be cutting it back. And that might be not the look you want to achieve right at the front of your house. So that's the basics for the base plan. I also mark which direction north is to keep in mind, and remember that on the north side of a building, a garage, a structure, throughout a lot of the year, it's going to be pretty shady. But then in the middle of summer, when the sun is very high, it's going to be full blasting sun. And so we need to choose plants that are going to be happy in both those situations. And there's a small but decent list of plants to choose from that are going to work well in those situations. Again, we go way into it in that favorite plants for Inland Valley Gardens class, where we have a whole section just based on that north-facing situation. So from there, you're going to do what's called your site analysis, which is just a fancy way of saying making sure that you mark down your observations and putting them on your base plan. And so if you're working with, like physically working with paper, get a pad of tracing paper, and that way you can have your base plan. Once you have that drawn out, I encourage you to scan it or photocopy it, because if something happens to it, you don't want to have to redraw it. Or if you're working digitally, you could do a save as, and then with whatever that base is, you can then have a site analysis file. Just putting down your observations, but putting them down over that base plan. So then when you're also looking at that base plan, thinking about what to put where in terms of the planting design, it's very logical and laid out for you. Part of design can be being very creative if you want, but design can also be just very linear, step at a time. If you're more of a linear thinker, you can still come up with a great, beautiful, creative looking garden design by going through a very logical and linear process. And site analysis doesn't need to be complicated. It's just based on observation. Making sure you put down the sunny areas and the shady areas, especially those north-facing areas where it might change throughout the time. If you have a existing tree, what is the extent of the area that is truly shady versus sometimes if you have a existing tree, a number of feet underneath the canopy might still get a decent amount of sun throughout a lot of the day. Soil and drainage. You are going to want to check your drainage if you don't know if you have well-drained soil or not. Quick notes on how to do a drainage test. Not that complicated. In a few places in your yard, dig a hole. About 1 foot deep and 1 foot wide, doesn't need to be perfect. Fill that hole up with water and let it drain out. If the soil is very dry, fill it up with water twice and let it drain out. Those first times, you're not timing it or anything like that. You just need to make sure that the soil all around that hole is wet. Some people, when they're doing a drainage test, fill up that hole and start timing right away. Not a good thing to do, because how your soil acts when the soil is very dry might be different than how your soil acts when the soil is very wet. And depending on the characteristics of your soil, it could drain slower when it's very dry than when it has some moisture on it from that hole, because of specific properties of the soil that we won't get into now, not relevant. But the important thing is fill that hole up with water once or twice, make sure everything's wet, because that's testing your drainage. As it affects your plants, what matters is when you have water or irrigation and the soil is wet and then gets wet again, how is the soil going to drain then? So you test your drainage when the soil is wet. So after making sure the soil is wet all around, sometimes it might need to be the next day. Fill that hole up with water, start the timer on your phone, or start a stopwatch. And what you want to get a sense of is how many inches per hour on average does the water drain down through that hole. The easiest way to do it, if you have the time, you're going to be around, and it's what I recommend, is set a timer every hour on the hour, measure how many inches that has dropped down. And you're going to want to record per hour how many new inches. So you're going to need a measuring tape. And normally I'll take either like a yardstick or a flat stick, a broom handle, or something to put across the top of the hole to give me a really nice, easy area to measure to. After that's done, you average that out. If your soil drains throughout that test at least 2 inches per hour on average, you have well-drained soil. You can plant all the plants that want well-drained soil. If your soil drains between 1 and 2 inches per hour, you have kind of medium draining soil. Not great, not the worst. You can often get away with most of the plants that want well-drained soil, but if there is like a series of storm events, a heavy rainfall year, some of those plants might suffer a little bit. It's a good idea when you're planting to plant those plants a little bit high to make sure that they have good drainage. In our installation and establishment class, we show examples of planting. We talk about planting high. We get way into that. So definitely check that out. If you're going to be doing this, this is only one half. Check out that installation establishment of native and water-wise gardens class. If your soil drains less than 1 inch per hour, you have poorly draining or heavy clay soil, and you definitely want to primarily work with the plants that are adapted to clay soils based on those lists and those resources, or plants that are adapted to slowly draining soils, or have some of those mounds if you want to grow some plants that grow in or that need that better draining soil. So those are some thoughts to help you out with figuring that out for the right plant, right place. Views, part of the site analysis, into and out of the property. So for me, like the view here, we wanted to make sure we were maintaining our view of part of the San Gabriel Mountains. At another place where I lived previously, where we were doing a design for our yard, and we had a chain link fence, which had a lot of visual permeability with the neighbor, where we wanted a more private space. So that was an important view that we wanted to block by putting in some shrubs. Either of those things, make sure you get those down so you can account for that with your plant heights, plant sizes. Water flows. So when it rains, water coming off the roof, coming from the driveway, any of that sort of stuff. Where does water flow? Does it accumulate anywhere? Are there any problems that need to be dealt with before you get to planting and getting to a state where it's really hard to do any of that work around your new landscape? Any of those microclimates, those particularly hot or cold areas, reflected heat off the driveway, you're going to need to remember to put plants that can really take that heat there. Are there noise or other neighbor issues? Maybe you'll need a water feature or something in a strategic place to kind of have the sound of bubbling water and block some of that noise. Or existing plants, like those ones you want to keep. Or are there areas with really bad seasonal weeds where, maybe you'll need to wait a little bit longer, do another season of doing something with the weeds and plant that area later. You can get that all down. As you do that, your own analysis is very important, but make sure to include all of the important stakeholders in your planting. So my cat and I are figuring out what next to do in our yard when it was only partially planted in the backyard and we had a lot of room to work still. And think about all of your different, I'd say stakeholders, but all the different people using the yard. Are there older people with mobility issues? That is going to affect the width of your pathways and the material of your pathways. I thought gravel was a really great pathway material until the first time that I had to push my grandfather in a wheelchair across a garden that I built. And that was just, he was visiting that one day, but it made me realize that if I was building a garden that was going to have a family member in a wheelchair who either lived there or was visiting often, decomposed granite, for example, which becomes a much harder, less aggregate kind of path material, would be much more appropriate than, for example, a gravel path, where oftentimes I'd use them, kind of interchangeably just based on, what I wanted or the look or the feel I wanted underfoot. So those functional issues, think through all of those. If there's kids in the garden, you might do something a little bit different as well, or you might have spaces that are, intentionally very interesting for kids to hop around on boulders or, any of that sort of stuff. So here's what the site analysis for this front yard looked like to meet those goals, remembering my mountain view. So, I just put mountain view through here. It's something that you think is obvious, but then you can kind of get tunnel vision once you're getting to the plant design. So I like to have everything down on a version of the base map. Here's where it felt too open, main planting area. Here is, we estimated about the depth of that seasonal shade from the north side of the house. This whole area surrounded by blue here would flood when it rains with the water coming off the roof. especially, and some coming down the driveway. So we had to do something about that. And for this specific set of goals and this specific site, those were the main aspects of the site analysis. Our soil drained well, so we didn't really have any concerns there. And then we're off to thinking about other aspects. So again, this is the time to remember, doesn't matter if, there's a typo in that page, doesn't matter if you really want to plant, if it's not the right plant for the right place, if it doesn't match your soil and site conditions, you're probably not going to be successful with it. So stick to the right plant in the right place in terms of sun and shade, size, soil type, and drainage. Size is one that as gardeners who love plants, we often do a bad job of paying attention to. Look at how large your plants are going to get and realize they will get at least that big. If you are growing in hot inland areas like the Inland Valley, a few of our native plants, like especially the sages, will often get bigger than the nursery information says. On the Inland Valley Garden Planner website, we have done our best to adjust the size up from our actual observation in local inland gardens, from just like the general plant information that's published elsewhere. But realize things will get at least that big. Oftentimes people are looking at their little 1 gallon plants thinking they're not going to get that bigger. It's going to take forever. And they plant things way too close. Things start growing. Oftentimes they start growing quickly. And right around the time where it would be time to start pulling out plants, if too many plants were planted, everything looks great. So nobody ever does that. And then a year later, 2 years later, things are overgrown. They either have to be hacked back or they're shading each other. When they're shading each other, leaves are dying back underneath. And it's just avoid that situation. Plant your plants to where you can accommodate their full size. And if things look too open until then, gently sprinkle a little bit of native wildflower seed into the mulch. Some California poppies, some Phacelia, some desert bells. There's all sorts of good different things. You can even get mixes. The local specialty nurseries and botanical gardens that specialize in native plants will sell mixes for different things, and the staff at the nurseries can oftentimes make suggestions. And those are just annuals. Just don't let them grow faster and like shade out your plants that are going to be longer lived. You might need to weed some of those out to make sure that those longer lived plants have space, but then those annual wildflowers can take up the spaces in between, give you beautiful spring blooms. And just don't overplant your long-lived plants. It just causes a mess and ends up causing a lot more work and heartache in the long run. And with that, you're going to do some fun research. So we talked about Kellscape, we talked about the Inland Valley Garden Planner, as well Tree of Life Nursery, Las Politas Nursery, and Theodore Payne Foundation, which somehow I didn't type out on this list, all have great websites with lots of good information. And as well, get involved with your local chapter of the California Native Plant Society. California Native Plant Society, both state level and local chapters, have active Facebook groups where you can ask questions and get responses from enthusiastic home gardeners who probably have dealt with whatever question you have. And so you use those resources as well. And visit local public gardens and nurseries with native plants, especially locally in Southern California. We have the California Botanic Garden in Claremont. Just about 10, 12 minutes away from that, we have our Waterwise Community Center demonstration garden here in Montclair. Tree of Life Nursery in San Juan Capistrano has beautiful demonstration plantings and is a great native plant nursery and does all sorts of free workshops, also currently online, but normally great programming. And Theodore Payne Foundation in Sun Valley as well are some of my top choices for seeing native plants in the ground in garden situations. And then as you do your research, you're going to fall in love with a bunch of plants probably. At that point, remember to keep it relatively simple. If you are new to gardening and are someone who wants to have a native plant garden, but you're not necessarily someone who is like, gardening is going to become my hobby, it's what I want to do on the weekends, I am going to self-identify as a gardener. Like if you just want a nice native plant garden, don't put in too many different species of plants and have to learn too much about all the different things. Make some great choices, do all that research, rely on the advice, but for the average front yard or backyard, 10 to 20 different types of plants, including trees, shrubs, perennials, is plenty. You can put in more if you want, But for the average gardener, don't put in 72 different kinds of plants. It's going to become overwhelming. If that's what you're into, that's awesome. Go ahead and do that. But also, if you limit your plant list a little bit to that 10 to 20 different kinds of plants for a front yard or a backyard, you have the ability to work more with that repetition, that grouping, some of those strong visual elements, and then those, accents and bits of surprise. That's going to also be easier to achieve kind of a aesthetically pleasing for the average person garden as well, that finds that right balance between interest and aesthetics. Whereas if you're working with 72 or 100 different kinds of plants, like you can do that, but that's really, really difficult. Our backyard, where my partner live, is a plant collection with high diversity and one of this and one of that to meet our specific goals for that area. But sometimes it has been quite hard to figure out how much repetition do we need, how many individual things can we have to find that balance. And again, respect the size. Definitely don't put in too many plants and crowd them, especially near pathway areas. Give everything, like around my pathways or my walkways, I'll often give everything just like an extra foot of space, unless it's a plant that stays very small, definitely for shrubs, because then when they inevitably get a little bit bigger than I am thinking, then I still can walk by. But if you put things too close and crowd them in, you're going to have to start cutting things back more, give things a little bit more space. I highly encourage you. And so here's where I go next, again, on another layer of my base plan, not necessarily worried about having drawn everything to scale unless I specifically want to, based on measurements. I start thinking, kind of feeling things out conceptually. If you are someone who is brand new to plants and also wants to draw things out to scale on your measurements, where you'll like measure things out, and then each square on a piece of graph paper, depending on the size of your yard, will be like a foot in each direction or 2 feet on each direction, you might go ahead and do it at this point. That way you can start to kind of feel out the size of trees and shrubs, but you don't necessarily need to. If you have a good sense of your space, especially, you don't necessarily need to do that. So here's what we figured out to meet our goals for this space. We would need a couple of small trees, and with working with California native plants, we ended up choosing large shrubs that can be pruned up into small trees. And so because this is our living room and we also eat dinner here in our living room, the view out of this window is like, we spend a lot of time there. We also have a couch in this room. And so this is something that we wanted to provide a little bit of sense of enclosure here. So we knew a small evergreen tree as kind of the background for this area because of the funny shape. If we had a square shaped lot, we could have put our small evergreen tree farther back here, but that was our driveway. So we needed to scoot it in a little closer. We wanted to have a layer farther back through the other area, but we also didn't want to have like a wall of shrubbery because we wanted to not totally turn our back to the neighborhood. So to balance that out, we decided we want a small multi-trunk tree here, where throughout part of the year, it could lose its leaves. The multi-trunk would have it be a little bit more open, not super dense, but it would still provide this backdrop, because we thought about how we use this space. And our backyard is really our social space. Our front yard is so much smaller than our backyard that we weren't going to use it as our social space. And so it's mostly about views. And so we wanted it to look nice coming up to the house, driving up the driveway if people are walking by. But mainly how we would experience our yard is from the inside looking out, other than when we're out doing our garden maintenance and stuff, because our backyard is the space where we spend time outside. And so for that, what we did is we set up our taller plants in the background layer from the primary view. And then working with smaller plants going forward was the idea of this kind of general concept to achieve what we wanted. The larger plants around the edge would provide us with that sense of enclosure and a little bit of privacy that we wanted. And one way of building a sense of greater depth within not a very large space, kind of a very traditional garden approach or garden design approach, but that works well, whether it's a naturalistic approach or a formal approach, is from your main view. You start with smaller plants in the front, and then medium plants in the middle ground, and then your tallest plants in the back. And it builds a sense of depth, which sometimes, like psychologically, looks deeper than it actually even is if you're not paying attention to building that sort of view out. And then close to the windows, so that when you're at the street looking in or walking up the yard, and this is, again, it's very, very sketchy. So for example, here's the circle for a shrub where really the shrub was more in the corner, but basically to frame the inside of these windows so that there's something, not just the stucco of our house to look at up against the house, but also just like one or two branches would then break the plane of the window to kind of frame the view out of the larger garden. We worked with some shrubs up against the house as well, but that didn't really block the view out of the windows. And so here we were going to work with relatively low, kind of knee height and below, sun and shade tolerant plants. We decided we have kind of a meadowy with some flowering perennial areas, and strategically putting a bird bath here so that both us, but especially our cats who spend a lot of time in these rooms, could see any action at the bird bath from either of these rooms. Kind of bird bath works with the sight lines from both of them, and figuring that out, because then the plants, even though you can move the bird bath, we're planning on the plants being around the base of the bird bath, being low, something we can walk through to clean out the bird bath that can take a little bit of extra water. And then framing that behind it would be some shrubs, and then behind that, the trees. And then the informal hedge. So a little bit of pruning, but not like really sheared hedge, kind of also a hedge for high habitat value for birds. And then we also put some C's where we wanted to make sure we had little pops of color. So example, we intentionally had the hedge not go to the very edge here and peel back, so we can have a little pop of some small perennial colorful native plants, which do all the things we want it to do, but also, you know, for our neighbor right here, gives a little bit of sense of the garden and not just you're looking at our hedge because we don't want to see you. Same thing for here, anyone walking by in the neighborhood or the mailman walking up the driveway, that sort of stuff. And then from there, we don't even jump into an exact planting plan yet, but then we start thinking about a little bit of refinement. What species of plants might fit each of these zones? So here are some of my favorite plants that can take that north exposure through here. I'm not going to list them all right now. You'll see pictures of them when I show you how this grew in, but you can refer back to this page if you're looking at, you know, kind of wanting to see the process. For our shrub, again, I haven't figured out which exact plants, but figured out which two species. As I'm looking at this in more detail, I realize that there's actually room for some more shrubs and middle-sized plants. So we decided to work with some native shrubs as well as some deer grass, and it would continue to evolve, but just kind of feeling it out. We did decide on our two largest plants, our toyon that we would prune up as an evergreen tree, and our western redbud that we would prune up over time as a multi-trunk tree. And then for these spots of color, figuring out the list of plants that would do that as well, and to extending into under these trees, especially at the beginning, where it's going to take a number of years till these trees are casting any shade. So it's all full sun. So we're going to work with some more perennials around them to begin with. And then decided on yarrow as our main ground cover plant, where we'd be able to, without leaving a pathway, because we're not going to walk into this garden that often, just kind of doing our maintenance. Yarrow can take a little bit of foot traffic. So the idea was we could walk out our door, walk through this yarrow area to this wider meadow where that's the main ground cover, and then access our bird bath, and then walk from there to do any of our other maintenance. So that's kind of the plan to meet all of our goals. A number of these plants, the native sages, the pitcher sage, when it's in full bloom, the verbena, also have that great smell, so that from the door even, or the screen door, that in the heat of summer, that smell kind of hangs in the air. If you are interested in drawing everything out on graph paper and kind of figuring that out, and you're looking for a guide about how to do that, a book for general water-wise gardening that's for free download online, that was sponsored by the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, called Lawn Be Gone. I set up a redirect to get you to their page where you can download it at cbwcd.org/G3book. G3 is the name of the organization that created this book for them. And that'll be a redirect that'll get you right to being able to download this. And starting on page 8, they have a pretty good walkthrough of, very nice walkthrough of starting with the site plan, taking your basic measurements, and then thinking through, like planning on holding on to rainfall, where to site that in, and then moving through some different other aspects of it to coming up with a planting plan. The only thing I want to mention is that they kind of did it through in terms of the scale, kind of through the lens of a smaller, kind of more urban lot, where they recommended 1 foot equals 1/4 of an inch. And if you have a small yard and you're trying to do the whole yard on one page, that works. But what we find for more suburban yards is I recommend buying a 11 inches by 17 inches pad of graph paper. And sometimes you can find that, especially if you order online, where they have smaller squares that are 1/8 of an inch within the larger squares. If you can get that, that's great. If not, then the 1/4 inch squares, but each 1/4 inch or larger square, then that 1/4 inch square would be 2 feet in each direction for a kind of larger suburban front yard or backyard. Or if you can get them with those tiny little 1/8 inch squares, then each of those 1/8 inch squares could be 1 foot. Or you could tile them out for something larger and do a larger drawing kind of with sheets taped together. Whatever's going to work best for the size of your yard. And so that's that. And so eventually that then gets me to my final planting plan, which is something for me. I work on this digitally. So I kind of create these circles in a drafting program because I do this all the time, and then kind of figure out the size of each plant. But if I didn't have that drafting program, I just do that in graph paper. It works just as well. And then I'm also in the process of creating a video that's going to go on the newly expanded stuff on the Inland Valley Garden Planner site that will walk through drawing out the graph paper plan and everything. So again, check back with us or sign up for our newsletter, and you'll get all the announcements for when all of that content is added. And so to kind of walk you through what that looked like as we installed that, even though this isn't really a class focusing on installation, figured after the design, you should see how that all comes together. So this is the property when we moved in. This is the property in January when we were just kind of getting started. We had stopped watering the lawn. A good amount of it was dead, but we knew that if we started watering, a lot would come back. And so we were going to work with some techniques to help us with that. March 10th, again, so based on what I said, this is past the ideal time for planting. This is towards the very end of what I would recommend as a planting window. But we decided to push the schedule because I wasn't going to be the water conservation person who was watering the lawn I didn't use, but I also wasn't going to be the person who just moved into this neighborhood and was going to leave the yard looking like this until the fall. So we decided to go ahead and push it and make it happen. As you're laying out your plan that you planned out on paper, remember that that's just something on paper. So if you lay out your plants and then kind of walk through your landscape, picturing how things are going to grow in, and spend some time doing that. If you need to spend a couple hours doing that and re-looking up online different plants and kind of picturing how they're moving in, adjust things, make sure it feels good. I usually end up shifting around a few things as I do that. And really, really great planting designers who are much more talented than I am do that as well. Because once you're there on the site and can really see from, not just picturing it in your mind's eye on a plan, but really walk through and see how things are going to line up at every angle and how things feel, you might want to adjust some things. Do it now. It's a lot easier than before you plant. And so you can see everything we planted here was from a 1-gallon plant or the yarrow we were able to get in 4-inch and put there. No need to buy big things. These plants get growing, and the big plants often grow slower and are less healthy in the long run and are, take a lot more work to plant. And so this is it right after it's planted. Most people at this point in time think, oh my God, it's never going to grow in. I should have bought my plants way taller. I should have bought way more plants. Just take a beat, have faith that your research is going to pan out, and just give it a few months. So this is March 2019. This is the big delivery of mulch. Most of this mulch is for our large backyard. So for a small yard like this, you don't need necessarily this much mulch. If you need to figure out how much mulch you have, you can go on any search engine, type in mulch calculator, a few websites will come up, and you could put in your square footage and the depth of mulch you want, and it will tell you the volume of mulch you need, whether it's wood chips or gravel or decomposed granite or whatever for that size of a space. And then we were working with that sheet mulching technique. So laying cardboard down as a biodegradable weed barrier. Ideally, and what I would recommend if you have the time, if you are using this as your main weed control technique or killing the grass, put down the cardboard, lay out your mulch, and leave it for 2 months during the warm season of the year. Like if you're thinking about this in the summer, to really have the grass smothered during the time that it wants to grow, have it be dead or much weaker, and then plant in the fall. So again, we didn't follow the ideal planting schedule or project schedule, but we knew what we were getting into and were willing to deal with that. But that would be the ideal situation. So all mulched at approximately 2 months. Again, planted small. This is that Western redbud that's going to be a tree. But some of the small plants are starting to get a little bit of color. Here we have firecracker penstemon. And then at about 2.5 months, you still see a lot of mulch, but continuing to grow. This is our French drain system that still had more work to do, more larger rocks being brought in to be more naturalistic, but it would take the flooded water. It's basically a trench filled with gravel, take that flooded water around to the side of the house to where it could be in the wider, more naturalistic dry stream bed. Again, if you're interested in all those techniques and seeing more step-by-step on these features, check out our Rainwater Harvesting for Home Gardens workshop. And so here it is, continuing to grow in, had some plants that we had to rip out in the backyard. So we're leaving some of that woody material for the habitat value as well. And then August that year, looking out and still have a lot of growing to do, but realized all of a sudden it's more green than mulch. You know, it's a garden. And so here you can see it around that time of year. And so you can see how much things have grown already, starting to get some color. Definitely still a lot more growth to be done, but it's definitely on its way. It's very different than it looked after that, you know, all little tiny 1-gallon plants. And oh my God, is this ever going to grow in? You'll notice here that we changed our sprinklers. We didn't go to drip irrigation. Sometimes that's the best approach, sometimes not necessarily, but we changed our sprinklers to high efficiency sprays on a taller riser. Yes, you do see them, but most people don't even notice them once the garden grows in. They're looking at the garden. And it's just a way of basically making it rain over the area with a high efficiency approach. So it's very different than a traditional lawn sprinkler approach. Either way, whatever you're doing, if you're putting something in where there used to be a lawn, you're going to need to change your sprinklers somehow. We have a whole workshop and actually a whole playlist with supplemental videos for that. So check out our YouTube channel and check out our Renovating Turf Irrigation Systems for Native and Waterwise Gardens content, and that will kind of walk you through that whole approach. And so we're starting to get some nice flowers, California fuchsia coming in the summer. This is our Western redbud, and you start to see these semicircular cutouts. This is habitat in action. These are native leafcutter bees that like to use Western redbud to build their nest. Didn't actually ever see the bees on it, but now that we know that they're around, that's great. Habitat in action. You can see things starting to grow in at the edges of our water capture feature. August of that year, we had a hummingbird move in and basically decide that she lived in the yard. This was her turf, chasing off all the other hummingbirds. Little bossy girl hummingbird, and she would spend a lot of time every single morning. I'd see her from our front window on this one particular dried blade of California fescue grass. Don't cut up and tidy too much if you're trying to maximize wildlife habitat, because the wild world will use things like that, old seeds, all of that sort of stuff. And so this is first year. This is trash day. Still a lot of growing to do, but it's a garden. You always lose a few plants, so if it happens, don't worry about it. Reflect back. Is it right plant, right place? Maybe you want to try something else. In this particular area, this is red buckwheat. It's actually a coastal species from the Channel Islands. It is very adaptable, but if it gets full blasting sun with reflected heat inland, it likes a little bit of extra water. So it gets water every other week in our parking lot at the Waterwise Community Center and does pretty well. Here, especially over time, we water less in this spot, which is reflected heat. And so I planted 3, one of them still living, and then the other areas, we're going to replace with something else. It does great in our backyard where it's not that hot microclimate, but wasn't quite the right plant for the right place where we got our afternoon reflected heat from our driveway. So this is approximately 6 months. Again, more growing to do, but well on its way. Start to get these beautiful moments like the color of the new growth on the sunset manzanita with the deer grass in the background. Allen Chickering sage, and you can see that the sage is kind of almost done blooming, but these seed heads are still here and quite ornamental. And eventually when we cut it back, we'll leave the seed heads in the garden because some of the smaller birds that like to get, medium-sized birds that like to get seeds off the ground will come around for them. So at 13 months, got another delivery of mulch in the driveway for the backyard. And so I was able to stand on top of that and get kind of the overhead view of how things have grown in. You know, the trees still have quite a bit of growing to do, but a lot of the other stuff is pretty much full size. And you can see these pops of color at the edges, the yarrow growing in. Again, everything sometimes does get a little bit bigger. And we found out that our soil in Pomona, particularly native plants, a lot of these plants get bigger than anywhere I've ever seen them. We have nice kind of loamy soil with some gravel, so really good drainage. And so our fragrant pitcher sage, for example, has grown a little bit farther. If we cared about keeping this area nice and open and wanted to maintain a certain look, we certainly could prune it some because it was not grown over that much, but we're fine with the very wild and rambunctious look. So we just let it go. Your decision will be whatever your decision is if you find those sorts of things. But we made sure initially that we at least had as much space as we were anticipating the plant to get so that it's still not like crazy overgrown, even when it does grow a little bit larger. So some other just kind of moments of the juxtaposition of color. Here's our coffeeberry hedge growing in, and then native cherry on this side. So great habitat plants. And I talk about the concept of habitat hedges and mixing different species to maximize habitat value in our gardening for birds, butterflies, pollinators, and more class. And we'll talk about, a lot more about habitat hedges there. But California coffeeberry is one of my main plants go-to for that. That's another one of those ones that looks nice and green and even as along with the cherry year round. So as a big block of a hedge, that's something that we chose on purpose because it's in the front yard, whereas some plants in our habitat hedge in the backyard are more kind of have an up season and a down season, which we don't mind seeing, but we might not want to put right there in the middle of the front yard. So here's the view from the room our cats mostly hang out in, and it's well on its way. And so last couple of pictures talking about thinking through the seasons of flowering. And again, I think more about seasons and less about flower color, to always have something in bloom, to provide nectar for pollinators and hummingbirds, and then to have kind of like a flow of seeds coming in after that for the birds that will eat diverse kinds of seeds. So this is April after 13 months, and you can see the penstemons, and this is a Heuchera maxima, or island coral bells, and then the foliage of the yarrow, and then the backdrop with grasses and sages, and the hedge just starting to grow in. And then after those initial spring flowers are done, in summer, kind of a whole other set takes on from the same perspective. So this is June, and so then we have the sage, the hummingbird sage, the coyote mint, and the yarrow all in bloom there. And then this is September after the record heat wave. And so you can see, I intentionally wanted to show this to you. You know, I still think this is much more interesting than a lawn. It doesn't photograph as well. It has its own beauty, definitely, in terms of ways that are much more than just the photograph, especially when you see the wildlife and the smell of these plants. But even those fancy magazine gardens, at the end of their down season, whether it's in the fall or in the winter or wherever, at the end of their season, none of them look perfect. So it's not going to look perfect year round. And that's just the reality. But this is still, there's a lot of beauty there, a lot of interest. And learning to appreciate some of those golds and more dormant colors, and then working again with those evergreens. So for example, on this north side, this is a creeping Oregon grape, and we have, you can't see it yet because it's still very small in this picture, but our evergreen hedge that's going to grow in. So we intentionally worked with some evergreen plants that will frame things while some of the other plants we let kind of dry out seasonally, or they're just going to be a little bit drier seasonally. And if you really want to keep the look cleaner, as soon as things dry out, you can cut them back a little bit quicker. I tend to be a little bit more lax on my cutback because I don't mind this at all. And also, like our toya on our tree is going to be a really nice year-round evergreen when that grows in. So that will hold some of the space as well. And then just to kind of talk a little bit more about plants in some of our last few minutes, I do want to cover, because in inland Southern California, the plants that are going to survive that heat are, and it will not even survive, all these plants will survive, but the plants that will thrive in that heat, that will look good in the late summer, early fall, that will look great through those extreme heat waves that are becoming more often. I did want to mention some of those as part of this class. And so here are some pictures of things that I took in that fall where we had historic heat and fires. And so I went out like during that. The lighting was kind of weird in some of these pictures. You can see the ash on the coffee berry, but still California coffee berry looking good. This is actually a Baja plant, but Baja pitcher sage looking great. Holly leaf cherry, our native cherry, looking great. Sunset manzanita, another very reliable evergreen. Look at that beautiful bark. And from the backyard, here are some of my heat wave summer stars, the plants that we can balance with those exciting spring color plants of the sages and things like that, that in the high summer, early fall are going to look great. The native buckwheats tend to do very well with that. Palmer's mallow, which is a true desert plant, does very well in heat. California goldenrod likes a little bit more water. It doesn't need a lot, but thrives with a bit more water. So this is growing underneath some of my fruit trees and comes into bloom in the late summer through fall. So it's great to extend that flower season. Desert willows just take all that heat and through the whole hot season, turn that heat into flowers. So those are some of my favorites. And because we only have a few minutes left, what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip this question part and just cover some of the last notes about habitat design and mulches to make sure I get you that information. And then I will answer all of the questions at the end. So a note on mulches. So mulch is just anything that covers the surface of the ground, helps control weeds, helps shade and keep the soil cool, which you want to kind of try to keep your soil cool if you're watering in the summer, because that's where native plants are sensitive. They don't like hot, wet soil. If you have a woodland type ecosystem or going for a woodland look, wood chips is a very logical thing to do because for your mulch, because woodlands are adapted for all of that leaf drop over the years. If you are doing chaparral and or desert plants or a combination of them, gravel or decomposed granite as you're covering is a good default to kind of mimic what they're used to, or you can do a combination of those and wood chips. So it's not all wall-to-wall wood chips, but you're kind of mixing different things. And sometimes that's a very economical way to do it. And it keeps things from looking too harsh when the plants are young. If it's all gravel and then little plants, it looks pretty harsh for a while. So that combination can help. What I normally do with my native plant gardens is I kind of take an approach of what I say one and done with wood chips, which is when I plant, I quickly want to cover the soil. I want to do it economically, and I want to make sure that the soil is shaded. And I don't personally like the look of wall-to-wall gravel in a large garden right when it's getting going. And a lot of that gravel, if you do that after 2 years, is going to just never be seen again underneath the canopies of the shrubs. And so that's also a lot of material to move and pay for that is not necessarily going to contribute much later on. So by doing wood chip across the garden once, as those shrubs grow in, as the ground covers grow in, they're going to be providing their own organic matter just with the few leaves that drop over time. And then in some of the open areas, I'll bring in some kind of rock and boulders and other kind of woody material left over from tree trimmings or whatever to kind of accent the garden as things go forward. And then in my planting areas, after that initial wood chip mulching, normally the mulch will become a mixture of the stone, the woody material, And then some of the prunings from when I cut back things, I'll just chop up with my pruners to add on to that mulch layer in between plants as needed. And then there's lots of good seeds, dried seeds and things like that in there for the birds. And then generally after that, my touch-up mulch is just if I have wood chip mulch for pathways, I will do that. So very quickly, some habitat basics. We already talked about why it's important to design for habitat. So I'm not going to go over that. We get way more into that in our specific habitat class. But the basics, which I can sum up, is you want to provide food, water, and shelter. Many of our animals, our birds, our insects are generalists, where they'll go for just a diversity of nectar and seed sources. Some are specialists that really need a specific kind, and you can do that research. A lot of butterfly caterpillars are specialists where they will focus on one specific plant. So diversity is important. Having some buckwheats and some ceanothus and some coffee berries will get different kinds of butterfly larvae. Everyone knows about the monarchs on milkweeds, but there are other ones as well. But in general, if you don't want to do that research, you don't necessarily need to. If you plant a variety of native plants, that you do the research and you make sure that they're going to be blooming throughout the year. If when flowers fade, you don't cut off the seed heads too soon. And as long as you're not in a high fire danger, when you do cut them back, leave them in the garden, chop them up, have those be your replacement mulch layer over time, and provide some source of water. You're going to have a really, really great habitat garden. And so providing food, here's a white sage plant next to my back patio, and the goldfinches come around as soon as the flowers dry out and the seeds are ripe and spend a lot of time picking through them. Buckwheats are good. Yarrow provides good nectar sources. Western redbud, just one example. These become kind of like bird feeders with the pods. A variety of different plants and seeds. And you can definitely look up using any of those databases, ones that are the best for birds, or you can use our bird and butterfly very simple list as a basis to get started and add plants from there. But food is important. Water, it's amazing what will show up just by putting a bird bath and changing the water daily. You want to keep your bird baths clean. I prefer a glazed ceramic dish on top of something like a tree stump, or even I have one in my yard where it's on top of a cinder block surrounded by just some broken concrete so you don't see the cinder block, because glazed ceramic is really, really easy to clean. You want to scrub them down really well once a week and then change the water daily. So locate it near a hose. Birds have no decency. They'll poop in their water, but that will just bring so much life, a reliable source of water. I also like to include some sort of recirculating water feature if you can. Other birds will be attracted to that. Ours in our yard is just a horse trough. This is in our previous yard, which was kind of a very wild affair of existing plants and plants we added into the shade. Just a horse trough filled with water, some plants and rocks propped up on milk crates, and like a $30 fountain pump from the hardware store with just a cord that goes out the back, connects to an outdoor extension cord and an outdoor outlet. Birds also like just kind of fancier ones. You don't need a fancy one, but these kind of fancier approaches where it's a pot that then skims over with water and it goes to an underground recirculating vault. Some birds like to perch on the edges of these, let the water go over their feet and drink some. So those are nice too. If you're thinking about native pollinators, some native pollinators are ground dwellers. So a patch or two of bare soil is quite important, not wall-to-wall mulch. A few logs or larger branches are good for edging too, but all sorts of little insects will go into those. Some of our pollinators will bore into wood and live in there. A lot of the little beetles and things like that make important food for lizards or birds. I have a lot of this stuff around because I'm not in a wildfire area. I have never had a problem with termites. If you are worried about it, or if it's a problem in your area, you might not have too much of this, but that's never been an issue for me. And butterfly habitat. There's great information about butterfly habitat on a particular YouTube channel called Landscape Integrity Films and Education. They have a lot of great videos, but for those of you inland, they have a whole series of videos of great plants for inland areas filmed in a very beautiful residential large garden in Riverside. And the host talks a lot about which plants are good for both the larval stage, what the caterpillars need to eat, and then the adult stage for the nectar for different butterflies. If you're interested in monarchs, narrow leaf milkweed, for those of us in Southern California, is the milkweed to plant. We talked a little bit about that earlier. And then nectar sources can be varied. Penstemons make great nectar sources, as well as larval host plant for some species of butterflies. The plantains are important larval host plants for some others, including buckeyes. And then manzanitas for winter nectar sources are very important. And this time of year, coyote mint is about one of the favorite nectar sources for the butterflies in my garden. And then for birds, very important to have some structure and cover. So in addition to the seeds, you need plants that are good for butterflies, because baby birds are raised mostly on caterpillars. And so that brings it all together. That's why we have a bird and butterfly garden. It's almost like a packaged deal. And structure and cover means, like, if you have room for a large tree, like an oak tree, go for that. Those habitat hedges, kind of some dense shrubs at the edge of a property line, super important for nesting sites as well as cover. Year-round food. Again, there's a picture of a manzanita, because for hummingbirds, it's a really important winter nectar source. And then also, some places to perch are much appreciated, where some of the insect hunting birds, like Black Phoebe right here, will perch on it, and then you'll get to see. So this was taken from sitting at my desk in this window. Black Phoebe flying out, catching insects, and then hanging out, looking for its next one. And then in the very last few slides, lizard habitat, put out some rocks, some piles of rocks. They'll appreciate you for it. And then all sorts of other wildlife will show up to the party, like this praying mantis pod. And then finally, don't forget about the human habitat. So shade or a shade structure. Some chairs, a nice place to sit and watch it all. Our gardens will kind of magically seem easier to care for if they are comfortable places we enjoy spending time in. So a lot of my garden work happens with a cup of coffee on weekend mornings. I go out to see what's going on in the garden, and then I'll have my pruners or do a little bit of weeding as I'm walking around, just enjoying things. For those of you who are interested in resource conservation, like water, this is a low water landscape. Artificial turf, a few things here and there, relatively low water, sago palms. But it's not shelter for anyone. It's certainly not shelter for humans. It's certainly not shelter for birds. But something like this, which is just a very diverse home-designed garden, provides tons of shelter. Very interesting space to be. Very interesting place to kind of see all the changes and learn as a family. Doesn't need to be expensive. Here's a front yard garden on a pretty busy street in Pomona I saw and photographed a couple years ago. And then I started counting things up. I just first thought, it's nice. It's a lot nicer. It feels more set back from the yard than a lawn. But I realized that this is about $100 worth of 1 gallon plants and a packet of wildflower seeds if everything was planted small. It doesn't need to cost an arm and a leg to meet your goals. It's often better to keep it simple. Don't start with too many different plants if that's not one of your goals. And so here we have a beautiful Engelmann oak tree, manzanita across the parkway, some ceanothus, and then some mix of native and non-native plants in the shade. But beautiful front yard. And don't be afraid to start super simple. So here's a few native plants in the front yard picture I took. They are planted too close together, but I would much rather see this as a start for someone to start learning about native plants than for someone to feel intimidated about planting native plants. You can put some few things in the ground and just see how you do, build on your success from there and learn from your challenges if taking on a whole yard seems intimidating. Start with one planter, start with a pot, and go from there. So final thoughts and advice. I know it's a little bit after 12. Thank you for staying a little bit after class, everybody. There's so much to cover. But final thoughts and advice. Remember your goals for your project and focus on your goals. Those are going to be your filter so you don't end up with 87 random different types of plants, which might all be great plants, but might not help you achieve your goal. Keep it a little bit simpler even than you think maybe you want. And that's usually good advice for people, especially if they're new to this or not really trying to be gardeners as your hobby. Remember, right plant, right place. Use the plants that match your soil conditions, your sun conditions, and fit in the size. Think about how much time you want to spend working in your garden, because you don't need 172 different species. You can stick with the concept. Remember cues to care for your front yard if you are interested in that. Nice pathways, maybe some signs letting the neighbors know what's going on. To be successful, you do want to understand your irrigation if you have an irrigation system, and check it periodically. Check out those irrigation classes we have on our YouTube channel. Do a bit of research. And instead of thinking about maintenance, think about it as care. Something that I really like, that I kind of learned that concept from Mike Evans at Tree of Life Nursery, who talks a lot about how if we care for our gardens will care for us. And this can all help provide us with therapy from the stresses of life, spending some nice quality time in our gardens as we do our care. To help you with that, if you're new, chart your plants and make a care calendar for yourself or your gardener, if you have help from a gardener, so you can anticipate, this is what I'm going to need to do in the spring. This is what I'm going to need to do in the fall. Look to nature for inspiration and try to have nature's patience, because there's few true mistakes in a garden. Have fun learning from your experiences. And part of the fun of a garden is that it's never done. It's an evolving, breathing thing that we can appreciate being part of and being a steward of. But don't forget to enjoy it as you go. And so with that, I am going to leave up, here's those plant sources and plant information. I'm going to start answering all of those questions. But before you sign up, for those of you who need to go, I'm going to launch just a super quick closing poll, which is really important. So you can let us know how we're doing, or in this class, let me know how I did. In addition to the poll, I really love to hear like any detailed feedback. Doesn't need to be long, but any feedback people would have to type into the chat. There is no perfect way to present all of this information in a short amount of time. However, if there is anything that was particularly useful to you, I would love to know that, or maybe how you're going to use what you learned, or if there is anything that wasn't clear or you think could have been presented better, or really needs more time or another workshop, definitely please let me know in the chat. I read all of that and really take it to heart as we tweak things and develop more resources. And so with that, I will start answering questions as people fill out the survey. Okay, so from KB, can I recommend natives for fall color and pollinator support? So when so many plants have finished for the season? Absolutely. So for fall, a lot of the buckwheats are great for late summer through fall. California fuchsia, really important one to extend through the fall season. And there are just the species is what I normally go with, but there's certain cultivars that spread less. There's cultivars that are taller. So California fuchsia for sure. If you have room for some things that get a little bit wider or maybe are a little bit more rambunctious, California goldenrod, as well as the native asters are also really great for fall color through pretty late through the fall season. Those are some of my favorites, some of my go-tos for extending through fall. Okay, let me jump back to some of those people who I deferred from earlier. And I'm also going to be checking to make sure that people are still here. Okay, from Angela, had a few questions from earlier on that I had to wait on. What's the best time to trim a toyon? Planted one in February that's now 2 to 3 feet tall that I wanted to make into a shrub or a small tree. Suggestions for trimming methods. Toyon, can take a little, if you're keeping it as a shrub, can take a little bit of pruning anytime, but I would do significant pruning in the fall. If you do it too late in the spring, you might cut off a lot of what's going to become your flowers or your berries. But if you are doing like cutting off a whole branch, you could do it in the spring. You just don't want to do it right in the middle of summer is the biggest thing. A lot of the woody plants can take a little bit of pruning kind of at any point in time. So let's see. From Rocio, what are the names of butterfly plants for monarch butterflies, and where can I find the plants or the seeds? So you're going to want to check for your local area. There's different milkweeds are the plants, but there's milkweeds that are not native, which are not as good for some reasons that we're going to take more time than it's worth getting into now. But you want to plant the native milkweeds that are going to do well in your area. For most of Southern California in our gardens, that's going to be narrowleaf milkweed. If you're in Northern California, you're going to want to check with local resources, maybe ask that question on the Native Plant Society Facebook page, or check with your local nurseries. And then it's going to be the local specialty nurseries native specialty nurseries that will carry it, maybe botanical gardens. And normally with milkweeds, because they're winter dormant, although most native plants you're going to want to plant in the fall through like early winter, midwinter, spring is when you're going to plant milkweeds, because that's when they're coming out of dormancy and mostly available from the nurseries. Seed, it is viable to do milkweed from seed, but they take a long time to grow. It's not like just tossing out California poppy seed. My partner grew a crop of milkweed for our garden, and they were in the little cells in the plant flat. Felt like forever. We kept watering them and they grew over time, but it takes a long time. It's not difficult to grow from seed, but it's not quick. Okay, from Linda. Is Linda still here? There is a Linda here, but not the same Linda, so we'll skip that one. From KB is still here. How do I combat the invasive English fox squirrels, which devastate native bird nest populations and destroy native trees? Yeah, that is difficult. I've not really seen anything that ever has suggested that fox squirrels are something that can be controlled. Even within like restoration context here in Southern California, there's been a lot of study in terms of English fox squirrels, or the invasive squirrels, and then competitiveness with our native gray squirrels. And there's even nothing that has come out of that, because they can displace them. There's nothing that have come out of that like suggesting that they can actually be controlled. Just quantity and diversity. And quite honestly, like sometimes I just chase squirrels out of my backyard just so they don't feel too comfortable being there. And they just go to the neighbor's yard. I'll open my back door and clap and just kind of wave my arms sometimes. And you know, they still come around, but it makes me feel like I'm doing something. Yeah, for if you are going to have bird houses, that's a whole other thing. I talk about that more in the habitat focused workshop, but making sure you choose houses that are focused on the birds you're providing that space for, and putting them, situating them on a branch where it's very difficult for a squirrel to get to them. Okay, so from Jennifer, is Jennifer still here? Jennifer's not here anymore. From Deborah, good question. What is a good time to prune? Depends on the plant. Check the entry. For the ones that we have in the Inland Valley Garden Planner, check the entry. We've put all of that there for each plant. And then sometimes for some of the specific ones, for example, Kellscape has pretty much all the manzanitas, information about all the manzanitas you would potentially plant in a garden. Doesn't necessarily have maintenance information about all of them. I can't remember if it has maintenance information about manzanitas. The maintenance information is there for some of them. You can take the maintenance information from, for example, a manzanita or a ceanothus that we do have the profile for in the Inland Valley Garden Planner, and apply that to any manzanita or ceanothus, any kind of closely related plant, even if we don't have the specific species or variety. That's usually going to be the same. From David, is David still here? David is still here. What native California cactus can you recommend that will fit within a Mediterranean garden? I'm in Ontario. Honestly, any of the native cacti, if you're going into true desert stuff, will work well in a Mediterranean garden in Ontario. You have well-draining soils usually. So that's going to be driven more by what is, I would say, I would recommend any native cactus that you can find in a local nursery. And if you're specifically looking for cactus, that's getting stuff out into true desert. There are also some agaves that are kind of local natives that do very well in gardens. So agave perii is a local native, and I'm not sure the common name on that, but you can find that. And then also our local yucca, it's actually a Hespero yucca whipplei, also called Our Lord's Candle is the common name, has nasty spikes on the end, but very beautiful plant. That's local native, and around here in wild areas grows in full sun, grows in full shade, just can grow anywhere. And it's a beautiful kind of geometric, low growing yucca. A pretty good place to get some of the native succulents is California Botanic Garden. They close their nursery for the summer, but they'll be opening back up in the fall once it's planting season again. And you can also check in with Theodore Payne Foundation out in the San Fernando Valley. Okay, Kim. Let's see if Kim is still here. Kim Lewis is still here. Would like to know which plants are not rat friendly. So like other than like avocados, fruit trees that are like really fatty kind of fruit, which is very attractive to rats. Mostly working like rats is going to be a structural thing. So for example, I don't remember if it was you, Kim, someone commented in about ivy. Like rats live in ivy, I believe, not because of the ivy itself, but just because of that structure that they can scurry under and have a lot of protection. So if you are specifically having a problem with rats, you might want to work with either small perennials or a combination of small perennials and then shrubs that are like woody shrubs that can be pruned up and expose the base so that it stays a little bit more open. In general, if you don't already have problems with rats, it's not something that I necessarily worry about. A lot of our garden at home is pretty like very naturalistic, pretty what from a traditional garden standpoint would seem overgrown, but it's what my partner and I would like. And we have a lot of fruit trees and we don't have problems with rats. So, but if you already have that, I understand, and think about structure. From Jordan, are birds picky about what flowers they'll eat from? And can we remove spent blooms if we leave them on the ground for them to eat? Good question. Yeah, some different birds will go for different dried flower seed or different berries, depending on which ones they are. So definitely, if you're interested in that, check out the Gardening for Birds, Butterflies, Pollinators, and More class that we have on YouTube, where I'm going to be teaching in the fall, because I go through like some of the top plant choices and like what specific birds like them. Like the finches like a lot of things with small seeds that will dry out. The medium-sized songbirds like jays and mockingbirds like a lot of the like fruit, like they'll come around for the fruit on coffeeberry, for example. So it just depends. In general, if you have that variety of native plants that flower and some of the shrubs that provide fruit, like the native cherries as well, you're going to have a lot of stuff. And exactly what you suggested, when the flowers do set seed, when I do cut them back, I leave a lot of that dry seed material to kind of be the next layer on the mulch, and then a whole bunch of other seed-eating birds that prefer to forage off the ground, especially the doves and the towhees, will come around for those once they're on the ground. Okay, from Lisa Go, very specific question. Can I recommend California native plants effective in soil remediation, specifically for lead? Have a couple of thoughts. It's a big topic. Sunflower family is known as being a really good accumulator for heavy metals. Oftentimes for bioremediation with heavy metals, annual sunflowers are used. And so the native like semi-weedy annual sunflowers would be a good choice. I would assume that the perennial sunflowers and cutting back would probably be the same. I've not seen specific research on it, but a lot of times that kind of does, like, some of that function is by family, but definitely the annual sunflowers. But you need to be kind of careful, because if the soil is heavily contaminated with lead, when you use those bioaccumulator plants, like when sunflowers are used at large scale restoration projects for that remediation, they are actually treated as hazardous waste and are disposed of accordingly. So you're gonna need to figure out, if you really think that they're going to be accumulating, what you're gonna do with it. You probably would want to consult, if it's a large scale project, with someone more knowledgeable than me. But I am under the impression from past kind of training that I've done that the composting process has some limited availability and potentially making some of those heavy metals non-bioavailable, but then you're still gonna have to know what to do with that compost. Like, you wouldn't put it on your vegetable gardens. In urban areas, like I know I visited an urban farming project in Oakland, which the natural site was contaminated with lead, the native soils. So they all worked like in raised beds above the soil, and putting down a thick layer of wood chip mulch, like 3-4 inches, so that the dust from the soil is pretty much contained underneath that mulch layer, and maintaining it was their approach. And that is relatively effective, because it's really the dust in the soil that causes, like, the harm to humans, inhaling it and all of that. So separating that as much as possible. So hopefully those are some things that will give you at least some ideas to look into. Okay, so from Anonymous, trying to get rid of our hillside ivy, which is a rat haven. Is there a way to find out which native plants aren't rat friendly? Same thing, I'd say look into that structure. So for your hillside, you're gonna want some ground cover, but maybe not big bushy ground cover. Shrubs and small trees are great for roots holding hillside, not necessarily surface erosion, but some of your shrubs, you're gonna wanna maybe prune them up so they're a little bit more open, and work more strategically with lower ground covers. So there's not a lot of kind of like overgrown ivy where there's that kind of structure for them to live in. And also, backyard lizards eat all of your monarch caterpillars. Any advice? Oh, that's really interesting. I would wonder if you've seen them actually eating, you've seen the lizards eating the monarch caterpillars. And if you have, I don't know, lizards are a good thing to have around too, but they are pretty voracious. I've not experienced that personally. I have tons of lizards in my backyard, but maybe plant more milkweed, so it's just a numbers game, and there's more habitat for more caterpillars. Okay, moving on. Debbie, I'm a total plant person. I love being in my yard. Are there more difficult native plants I can try my hand with? I love a good plant challenge. Woolly blue curls is one that's considered a little bit fussy. Mostly it's because it often gets overwatered, needs really good drainage, but blooms, like in my yard in Pomona, blooms so much of the year. So beautiful, smells great, loved by pollinators. So woolly blue curls, if you have good draining soil. And then also manzanitas and ceanothus. For most kind of beginning gardeners, the main manzanitas I recommend are Howard McMinn and Sunset, because they are very easy not to overwater, and they can take gardening conditions. But there's a lot of amazing manzanitas that can be a little trickier with knowing when to water and when to hold back. And then ceanothus as well. Those would be the ones that I would recommend starting with. Okay. Let's see, moving on. Let's see if Ken is still here. Ken, any suggestions on getting rid of nutgrass? I have a fair bit to clear before going forward. Yeah, nutgrass is pretty difficult. Yeah, glyphosate, like Roundup, I don't recommend people do that for turf, but I just want to make sure you know, like, that is not effective for nutgrass. And the only chemical, if you're thinking about that direction, the only chemical which still you need to apply a lot and is not super effective for nutsedge, also is nasty stuff that has a residual in the soil where you can't plant for at least a couple of months because of all sorts of effects in the soil. So I prefer an organic approach pretty much always, but definitely for nutgrass. the main thing that I will do is I will, with nutgrass, do like a double thick layer of cardboard mulch. And if I'm not going to plant there for a while, I won't wet down the cardboard mulch. So normally I wet down the cardboard mulch before I put the wood chips on top so that it can stay water permeable when the new plants go in. I will just leave it dry, put the wood chip on top, and then come back like quite a while later. What I find if you are planting soon or around existing plants with the cardboard mulch, once it's kind of getting watered and all that, some nut grass, it's sharp enough, it will poke through the cardboard, but it helps smother usually a decent amount of the nut grass in my experience. And the stuff that does poke through is pretty easy to pull out, but you need to stay on top of it. So then, Beth, that sedge is coming up through the cardboard. Yeah, stay on top of it. You can always add more cardboard. And then the other thing that I will mention is as your native plants get more established and you move towards watering more like once a month instead of once a week, the nut grass won't necessarily completely go away, but there will be less pressure from it. The nut grass likes water. It's very tough, but it's very tough, but it thrives in lawn conditions and regular watered conditions. So just stay on it, and over time, especially as you cut back your water, that's going to help you out. Okay, so Nakek, are you still here with your question about? Nope. Okay, yeah, and I understand that we're almost at half an hour. It's amazing that 40 of you are still here. So trying to answer all of the questions I can. There are so many questions. It's awesome that you all are so engaged, but yeah, it's taken me a while to get through all of them. So thank you for hanging out. From Kim, DG doesn't seem to stay flat and in place in a backyard with dogs. Do you use a sealer? My question would be if you're using stabilized DG. So stabilized decomposed granite, you get it, it needs to be kind of mixed in. So normally when you order the decomposed granite, you order it with stabilizer already mixed in. And then you go through a process of getting it moist and compacting it either with a machine or with a hand tamper to kind of get it all to hold together. That's what will help. That's what really makes it kind of be more like pathways. So normally that's used in pathways, pedestrian areas, and then if it's just used over plants, you use the non-stabilized. So you might need to redo it or pull it up and kind of mix it. You can get the stabilizer separately and mix it kind of one wheelbarrow at a time, but that's a lot of work. So normally people will order it from the location where you get it with the stabilizer already. It's quite a bit more expensive, but for like pathway areas, it makes it a much more useful material. From Robert, do all native plants grow well when planted together? In general, if you stick to the right plant, right place, sun, soil, water requirements, you can mix plants from different plant communities like desert and chaparral plants if they're going to be maintained the same way and all adapted. But if it's a plant from like a creekside area or from like way northern California, redwood forest, and you're mixing it with locally adapted, full sun, dry climate plants, then no, they won't necessarily work together. So it's just about doing that research and understanding that right plant, right place. Okay. Going on to the next question from Kim. We have a huge mosquito problem in Ventura County. Any ideas for water for the birds, but not mosquitoes? Certainly. If you change out your bird bath water every day, which you should be doing anyways, and if you're going to go out of town, just leave it empty, you will not have a problem with mosquitoes. Mosquitoes need 72 hours to complete the life cycle from a mosquito larva to like a flying adult mosquito. And they're very sensitive. So if you dump out the water, like they will not live through that as long as there's no like bowl that's accidentally collecting the water at the bottom. They just need that amount of time. So if the water is being changed out, they cannot complete their life cycle. So not a problem. And then, and mosquitoes are a problem here too. We've had new invasive mosquito species. And then like in my larger trough water feature, I have mosquito fish in there, which were given to me for free by our local vector control district. I don't need to feed them because just with the algae and the plants and the combination of insects that land there, they thrive and they need absolutely nothing. And it was like flipping a switch when they dropped off that bag of mosquito fish for us. We have never seen, you can look and see if there's larvae in there, never seen mosquito larvae in that water feature. We also do have recirculating water, so that that small pump that I showed, and that also helps keep the water oxygenated for the fish. So it's a very low maintenance system. The plants thrive, the fish thrive, and no mosquitoes. And then also, if you, like before we got the fish, then we would use this product called Dunks, which are a natural bacterial extract that also interrupts the life cycle of the mosquito larva, but I prefer to do it with fish. Judy, thank you for mentioning that. I just saw it come in with the chat. I did not realize that tomorrow is when Theodore Payne Foundation is having their special pollination party. So there is an event at Eagle Rock Brewery where milkweed plants will be available for sale in Eagle Rock. And I am, see if I can copy that. Oh, nope. Oh yeah, Judy was able to post it to all the attendees. Just want to make sure. So that is freshly in the chat if you are interested in that and are in the area and can get out to Eagle Rock. From Robert, Apple Valley have extremely high winds. Are there native plants that do well in high winds? Absolutely, but that might be one to, like, local chapter, if you can find up the California Native Plant Society, find out what's doing well there, or also go on some local hikes through, you know, some of those areas, hillside areas where you know that there's high winds, and see what's doing well there. But yeah, most of the smaller shrubs should do fine. Really what you need to make sure is in some of those larger shrubs, but even things like the toyon and the redbud, I think that they would probably be fine. But that's one of those best things where it's best to reach out to local people. But some of our high wind areas around here, like Fontana and Ontario, get pretty high winds, and most plants do well. The important thing is to make sure you water appropriately. Infrequent deep irrigation, like that once a month, but a deep soak through the whole like root zone, at least down to a foot, so that you're training your roots to go down deep, which will help stabilize them. A lot of problems that people have with trees overturning in gardens is that they water too frequently and not deep enough. So all the roots are at the top. Okay, let's see if Jordan is still here. Jordan, any suggestions for getting some of those decorative branches you've outlined your yard with? So when we moved to our property, there was a lot of like weed seedling trees that had never been, nothing had ever been done with them. They were overgrown. So like ash trees and Chinese elms that were like hazardous. So I don't like cutting down trees, but they had to be removed. The backyard had been totally abandoned for, it looked like, decades. And so we saved that material and reused that. But basically it's going to be working with local tree trimmers. Any place where you could potentially buy them from, and I don't know about them, it would be expensive to accumulate that much stuff. So basically, if a tree trimmer is working in your neighborhood, you know, you can try to tell them, you say, hey, if you leave some of those branches, I'll come by and pick them up later. So that obviously depends on what kind of vehicle you have, but it's about keeping an eye open and scrounging. Or if, yeah, a neighbor has a tree that has to come down or something like that, trying to work with them. Okay, from Robert, what native plants would you recommend to plant over a septic tank? It's a good question. I don't really have experience with septic tanks. If you're talking about being a wet zone, then kind of those like riparian or creekside place kind of plantings, kind of like looking at medium or higher water use plants. Yarrow is always, you know, an easy one that's great in a lot of different situations. Some of the sedges work well. Goldenrod works well. That narrowleaf milkweed could all be things if it's kind of like a wet zone within the soil. Let's see. Yeah, so Mike did text in that for the question of dunks. You know, there is potential for non-target insects other than mosquitoes. They get exposed to that water to, not all insects, but some of them can be negatively affected. And that is definitely part of why I prefer mosquito fish. So yes, thanks for mentioning that, Mike. Okay, what is the best time to plant a Palo Verde museum tree? Fall or spring would be the best time to do that. Okay, let's see. From Paola, I'm a student looking into master's in landscape architecture. Besides attending workshops, are there any professional resources for people with my interests? You might be able to find some resources from the American Society of Landscape Architects. That's the main kind of trade group. But the main thing I would say is see if you can get in touch with any other landscape architects in your area. You can try emailing people, say I'm a student interested in doing this. Might you have like just a minute one day? People are busy, they may or may not, but professors at the programs that you might be looking into generally do make themselves available if you get in touch with them, especially if you look up their research interests and if their research interests overlap with your interests. Yeah, definitely get in touch. And then a lot of times the student groups, there's like Facebook groups or things like that from the student groups at those schools. And you can try to check those out and maybe connect with some people online through there. Okay, from Allison, it's no longer here. Okay, Angela. Is looking for a class on seed collection, storage, and then eventually propagation for 10 to 20 most commonly native used plants. I do not teach that class, but Theodore Payne Foundation does teach a great native propagation class. They teach stuff related to seeds as well. And Jenny over there, who is in charge of their seed program, teaches great workshops. So I would recommend, I don't know if they have it coming up. Obviously, I don't know if they've started in-person workshops again. That's one that's definitely best to be done in person. But like I saw on their tour, I saw a front yard garden in Pasadena where the homeowner was a beautiful front yard. It was the first landscape that he had, native landscape that he had done. And a lot of his plants in the front yard, he did from cuttings during the workshop that was offered at the European Foundation and used what he learned afterwards. So I would definitely check them out for propagation content. I'm not sure if California Botanic Garden is teaching propagation these days. Okay. Oh, and Judy knew the answer. Judy just texted in. In-person workshops begin in July at Theodore Payne Foundation. So yeah, check out their schedule. Okay, from Ronnie. Do I know of any local suppliers of cardboard rolls for sheet mulching, working on 1,700 square foot project and would like to skip the cardboard collecting phase? Okay, good question. I don't know of good local suppliers for bulk cardboard, and that would be pretty expensive. So yeah, exactly, for rolls. So what I have done, and is, to me, it depends on how you're combining things. If you have a great, not great, but if you have a fresh, very strong lawn that you're just trying to abandon, there is, like, meant for the commercial landscape industry and agriculture, there is a supplier. I've never used them. I don't remember the name now, but I've seen their product. But basically there is like a semi-cardboard weed barrier product that's sold. You can check online. There is a brand that I used, at one point in time, but then I couldn't find it anymore. So check online for biodegradable weed barrier, and you can see if you can find a source. If it's kind of sporadic grass or patchy weeds, what I will do is I will use 2 or 3 layers of brown painter's paper from the local hardware store. You can get it in a just under 3-foot roll, just in the paint section. If you're doing that, make sure you use brown, not red. Red has a rosin layer that helps provide a little bit of waterproofing, not what we want for our gardens, but the brown. And I've used that plenty of times for just like general weed control when there's lots of like a big weed seed bank, but not when I'm killing like fresh turf. Or if you like are roughly digging out the turf and then just want that like extra layer to help prevent regrowth, 2 or 3 layers of that painter's paper covered with wood chip mulch is sometimes pretty effective.
great for just kind of taking care of general, like a weedy area with a heavy weed seed load. Okay, moving on. Okay, there. How do I deal with voles? Tunnels are hard to find until the plant does poorly. Yeah, voles are very tricky. Difficult to deal with. There's no just asking them to leave. The only way that I know of to deal with voles is to trap them. They make specific vole traps, which are a little bit different than gopher traps. You can find information online. Those are kill traps. Definitely don't use poisons. The poisons can bioaccumulate up the food chain. You don't want to do that. Poisons for rodents are causing all sorts of problems with coyote and raptor populations. So even if you're tempted, don't do poisons. But those traps are kind of a pain to set. Voles are kind of tricky to deal with, but that's the only thing I know of that's effective at all. Okay, from Parisa, what are some native plants that produce fruit for humans to eat? So the reality of the situation is that there are native plants that are edible, some that are even tasty, but they're not going to give you in my opinion, they're not going to give you a main food crop like an orange tree is going to, or even like a non-native blackberry bush. Like there are native blackberries, they don't produce as much fruit. There are native strawberries, they don't produce as much fruit, and they're tiny, and the birds will get most of them. The native currants, like the golden currant I showed, like we can eat them, but they're mostly pretty tart and they're tiny. So for native plants in the kitchen, oftentimes like what my partner and I will do is sometimes we'll use some of the native sages, which we use different in the kitchen than normal sages for specific culinary profiles. Coyote mint, sometimes my partner will mix into drinks and it can be really good. So using more as flavoring, but there's a number of books about California native foods and working with them. Some of them are through the lens of foraging, which I don't encourage people to forage in the wild, but a lot of those plants you can grow in the garden and do there. And then some of the local botanical gardens also, California Botanic Garden, and I think Theodore Paint Foundation as well, do classes on working with natives in the kitchen. So definitely check out those classes. From Doug, do you add more wood chip mulch every year or so? In my pathway areas, every 2 to 3 years, I'll add a little bit more to kind of freshen it up. In my planter areas, I'll normally just do wood chips that first year, that kind of one and done approach, and then be using clippings of plants and eventually mix in a little bit of rock and other kind of woody material. Okay, what eats mosquitoes? Birds. Another reason for bird habitat is birds eat lots of mosquitoes, especially I believe like black phoebe, some of those bug catching birds like mosquitoes, some of them. So that's another good reason at bird habitat. And with that, you just have to attract the birds, have things that they like other times of the year, have the habitat, and they will come. What eats ants? Good question. The main ants that we have problems with are the Argentinian ants. And I believe this is something that I heard secondhand from someone who's pretty knowledgeable, that our lizards that are in our gardens like to eat some of the native ants, but they don't like the Argentinian ants, which are the main ones that we have problems with in our yards. I don't have anything that seems to eat lots of those. They're just kind of part of life in Southern California. Occasionally, when I have problems with them, I will use taro specifically for ants only. So taro is a ant-specific insecticide. That brand sells stuff that's like a broad spectrum or mixed for all this other. I won't use any of that stuff. The specific thing that they have just for outdoor ants, the effective ingredient is just borax, like the old laundry additive. It's based on boron. It's natural, and it's just that with a sweetener. There's even recipes online to mix up your own with borax and sweetener, and that is an effective ant poison that is safe for everything else that's going to be in your garden, including people, dogs, and other insects and animals. So that is what I will sometimes do if ants are really bad, but it's not going to be like a flip a switch and solve your problem. That's if I have like a specific ant colony of the invasive Argentinian ants in a specific place that I need to deal with because they're negatively affecting a plant. Ants are just part of life in Southern California. Okay, so that is all of the questions, and it's 12:45, so I need to get going. But thank you very much, everyone, for staying to the end. Some great question and answers. And I'm going to briefly, as people leave, put up this for people who want to check out our upcoming workshop. Here's the link, the Garden Planner website again, and to sign up for our newsletter, which will tell you about everything. We're going to be releasing our next 6 months of workshops, getting those up online soon, so you can check those out and get registered. And also you'll get the announcement, hopefully within a month or so, of all of the new updates and design related content on the Inland Valley Garden Planner website going live. And here's also where you can get the recording after some light editing next week, and the slides will be available later to download here. So with that, thank you for joining us today, and I hope you have a good rest of your weekend. Bye.